I'd trade 10 herds for one night with you, but you won't even let me stay long enough to fix your fence." Margaret Sullivan didn't answer. She stood in the yard with a rifle she hadn't decided to lower yet, looking at a stranger who had just said the most honest thing any man had said to her since Thomas died, and the most dangerous. She was 41 years old, 60 days from losing everything her husband had built, and she was not a woman who could afford to feel anything for anybody. She lowered the rifle anyway. Some decisions she would learn make themselves. If this story is moving something in you, subscribe to our channel. Stay until the very end and drop a comment, telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Sullivan Ranch had never been a pretty place, even in good years. Margaret knew that. Her husband Thomas had known it too, and he'd loved it anyway. Loved it the way stubborn men love hard things, the way a man grips a fence post in a windstorm, just because letting go feels worse than holding on. Thomas had been dead 14 months. 14 months of Margaret holding on. She had a dog now that barely ate. 2 ranch hands who hadn't been paid in 6 weeks and were only still there because one of them, old Pete Garza, had nowhere else to go, and the other one, a boy named Cody, who couldn't have been more than 19, had made some kind of private promise to himself that Margaret couldn't quite explain. She had 43 head of cattle down from 112 when Thomas died. She had a well that gave water only if you pumped it like you meant it. And she had a bank loan that Elijah Morse had been circling like a buzzard since February. Now it was July. "Mrs. Sullivan." Morse climbed down from his horse anyway. He always climbed down anyway. He was the kind of man who interpreted "get off my land" as an opening position in a negotiation. He wore a gray suit in the middle of a Texas summer and somehow never seemed to sweat. Margaret found that deeply personally offensive. "I've come to speak with you about the matter of—" "I know what matter you've come about." "Then you know the situation is." "My situation," she said, stepping off the porch, "is mine, and I'd appreciate you not narrating it to me like I'm too old or too simple to understand it myself." Morse stopped. He had pale eyes that he used the way some men used guns, just to make you feel like something was aimed at you. "The bank has been patient. The bank has been patient," she repeated, her voice flat. "The bank hasn't planted anything in this ground. The bank hasn't pulled a calf at 2 in the morning in a March freeze. The bank hasn't buried a husband. So let's not talk to me about patience like it's something you invented." Morse pulled a folded paper from inside his coat. He didn't hand it to her. He just held it, and that was enough. 60 days, Mrs. Sullivan. The board has approved 60 days. After that, if the note isn't settled, the property transfers all of it, the house, the grazing land, the well access. And if I find the money. If you find the money, he said, his tone making clear he found the prospect academic, you keep your land. But I want to be honest with you as I have been from the start. You have not been honest with me from the start. He blinked. I beg your pardon, the interest rate on that note. She took one step toward him, and she was not a large woman. She was 5'4" and thin from a season of eating less than she needed, but something in the way she moved made Morse go still. Thomas signed for 6%. The paper you sent me in April shows 8. I'd like to know when the bank changed the arithmetic and why nobody told me. For just a moment, one small revealing moment, Morse's composure cracked. Something moved behind those pale eyes. Then it was gone. I'll have our records clerk look into that. You do that. She held his gaze. And while he's looking, you tell him that I'm looking too. Morse folded the paper back into his coat, climbed back on his horse, and rode off without another word. Margaret watched him go. Then she turned around, walked back into the house, sat down at the kitchen table, and pressed both hands flat against the wood, because it was the only way she knew to stop them trembling. Pete knocked on the doorframe 20 minutes later. He was 60-something, leather brown, with a white mustache, and the careful movements of a man who'd lived long enough to know that most things worth doing deserved to be done slowly. He gone? He's gone. He coming back? In 60 days. She looked up. Pete, I need to know the truth about something. He came in and sat down across from her without being asked. "All right. Can we move enough cattle to market before the 60 days are up? Honest answer." Pete was quiet for a moment. That was the thing about Pete. He didn't fill silence with comfort the way some men did. He let silence be silence until he had something real to put in it. "If we get rain in the next 10 days, he said finally, "the grazing comes back, some cattle put on weight, we get a better price per head. If we don't get rain," he paused, "we still sell, but we're not going to love the number." "How short would we be?" "Short enough that it matters." She nodded. She'd expected that. Expecting a thing she'd learned didn't make it easier. It just meant you didn't also have to deal with surprise on top of everything else. "What about the fence line on the north pasture? Cody said it came down in the last wind." "He's working on it. I'll go help him after supper." Pete gave her a look that was not quite argument. "Margaret, I know." She pushed back from the table. "A woman alone can't run a ranch. A widow's got no business trying. I've heard it, Pete. I've been hearing it since the week after Thomas's funeral. If I listened to it, I'd have already sold and moved to my sister's place in San Antonio and spent the rest of my life being grateful for what other people allowed me." Pete almost smiled. "I wasn't going to say any of that." "What were you going to say?" "I was going to say you should eat something first. You didn't eat lunch." She stopped, looked at him. "Oh, there's cornbread on the stove." She sat back down and ate the cornbread. She didn't taste much of it, but she ate it. The stranger arrived the following morning. She heard the horse first, a slow, uneven rhythm that was wrong somehow, the sound of an animal favoring a leg. Then she came around the corner of the barn and found a man she'd never seen standing in her yard, holding his horse's bridle, crouching down to look at the animal's left foreleg, with the kind of focused concern that told her immediately he cared more about the horse than whatever inconvenience bringing him here had caused. He was tall, dark-haired, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a face that had seen weather and hadn't complained about it. He wore a plain gray shirt, road-worn boots, a hat with a sweat-darkened band. No flashy spurs, no silver. He looked like a man who'd never in his life spent money on looking like something other than what he was. He straightened when he heard her footsteps. "Ma'am?" He touched the brim of his hat. "I'm sorry to come up on your property without asking. I'm Jake Ryland. My horse threw a shoe about a mile back, and she's been walking tender. I didn't want to push her past what she could handle. I saw your fence line and figured I'd ask if you had a farrier or a forge I could borrow just long enough to sort her out." Margaret looked at the horse. A bay mare, maybe 8 years old, well cared for. Calm eyes. The kind of horse that trusted its rider. "I've got a forge. Pete Garza does rough farrier work, not fancy, but it holds." "I'd be grateful." "It'll take a few hours." "That's fine." He looked at his horse, then at her. "I can pay for the time and materials. I don't want something for nothing." She studied him. Traveling light. No pack mule, no extra horse, just him and the one animal and the gear strapped to her. A man going somewhere, or leaving somewhere, or both. "Where are you headed?" He seemed to consider whether that was a reasonable question or a nosy one, and then he apparently decided it was reasonable. "North generally. I had work lined up in El Paso that fell through. I've got a name in Amarillo who might have something, but I'm not in a rush to get there. The mare needed rest anyway." "You a cattleman?" "All my life." She looked at the fence on the north side of the property that she could see from where she was standing, 3 rails down the post leaning. She'd been out until past dark last night helping Cody with it, and they'd fixed 2 sections, and the third had beat them. She looked back at Jake Ryland. "Pete's at breakfast. I'll take you to him." He was still there by noon, not because anything had gone wrong. The shoe was fixed in the first hour, done properly, better than Pete had done in years, and Pete said so, which was not something Pete said lightly. Jake had simply worked alongside him with the quiet competence of a man who'd been around forges and horses his whole life, and when it was done, he'd walked out into the yard and seen Cody struggling alone with the fence post and walked over and picked up the other end without being asked. Margaret watched this from the porch. She couldn't help it. She watched the way he worked, not showing off, not explaining himself, just working. He'd been given one reason to be here, the horse, and now the horse was fine, and he was still here, fixing something that wasn't his problem. "Careful," she said quietly to herself, to no one. But she didn't tell him to stop. At midday, she brought water out for Cody and Pete, and she brought a cup for Jake too. He took it and drank half and handed it back. "Thank you." "You don't have to stay," she said. "The shoe's done." He looked at the fence line. 3 more sections were still down that she could see. "You're short-handed." "I've been short-handed since February." "I can work," he said, "if you'll have me. I don't need much, a place to sleep, something to eat. I'm not asking for wages. I don't take charity." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, more like recognition. "Neither do I. I'm asking to earn my keep. There's a difference." She held his gaze for a long moment. She had learned through 14 months of being alone and making decisions alone, and facing men who thought her circumstances made her foolish. She had learned to trust her read of people. It was one of the few things she fully trusted anymore. Jake Ryland looked back at her without flinching, without the particular kind of male discomfort that men felt when a woman looked at them too long and too directly. He just waited. 2 weeks, she said. "We'll see how it goes." "Yes, ma'am." "And don't call me ma'am." "What do I call you?" "Margaret." He nodded. "Jake." "I know," she said. "You told me." He was up before sunrise the next morning. She came out to start the cook fire and found him already in the yard working on the water pump that had been giving trouble for a month. Not making a production of it, just working. She stood on the porch and watched him for a moment in the early light, the way he moved with that particular economy of motion that came from years of hard work, no wasted gesture, nothing done for show. It irritated her somehow. She couldn't have explained why. Maybe because it made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Specifically, she felt the absence of Thomas, the shape of the space her husband used to fill. And it was painful in a way she hadn't braced for that morning. She went inside and made biscuits. By the end of the first week, the fence was repaired. By the end of the second week, the east water trough had been rebuilt, 2 calves that had been sick were recovering, and the pump worked without the grinding sound that had been driving her toward madness for 6 weeks. And the town had noticed. She knew it before anyone said a word. She'd grown up in a small town, and she understood the particular physics of rural gossip, how it moved, how it gathered speed, how it found every crack in a woman's reputation and widened it. She'd expected it. She'd braced for it. And then Dorothy Sims came by on the 8th day, under the pretense of returning a pie dish she'd borrowed in April. A pie dish she easily could have returned at any time in the past 4 months, and within 3 minutes of sitting down at Margaret's kitchen table, she'd said with the careful gentleness of a woman who considers her cruelty a form of concern, "People are talking, Margaret, about the man." "People can talk," Margaret said, pouring coffee. "A woman in your position." "What position is that?" Dorothy paused. "Alone. Without a husband. It just doesn't look right. A man living on your property, people don't know him. Nobody knows where he came from. He came from the road," Margaret said, sitting down. "Like most people do. He came with a horse that needed a shoe, and he's been working this property harder in 8 days than most men would in a month. And what it looks like to people who aren't working this property and aren't carrying this note to the bank is frankly the last thing on my list of concerns right now." Dorothy's face arranged itself into the expression of a woman who has been wronged by someone she was only trying to help. "I'm just saying what people say." "I know you are." Margaret drank her coffee. "And I appreciate you coming by. Give my regards to Edward." After Dorothy left, Margaret sat alone for a long moment. Then she heard Jake's voice outside talking to Pete about something. The tone of it easy and low, a question asked, and then Pete's answer, and then a short laugh from Jake that she hadn't heard before. It was a good laugh. Honest. She picked up her coffee cup and found it empty and stayed sitting there for another minute anyway.
So,
That night, she couldn't sleep. This had been a regular feature of the past 14 months. She would fall asleep easily enough and then startle awake at 2 or 3 in the morning, with the silence of the house pressing in on all sides. Thomas's absence taking up the exact same space as Thomas's presence used to, which was everywhere. She'd learned to get up rather than lie there fighting it. She'd drink water, sit by the window, sometimes read until dawn. She was sitting by the kitchen window with a book she wasn't really reading when she heard footsteps on the porch. She went still. Then Jake's voice, carefully not startling her. "It's just me. Couldn't sleep either. I can go if you'd rather." She was quiet for a moment. "There's water in the pitcher," she said finally. He came in, poured himself water, leaned against the counter rather than sitting down, as if he didn't want to presume too much familiarity. They were quiet together for a while. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. That surprised her. She'd forgotten that silence with another person could feel different from silence alone, could feel sometimes like rest rather than wait. "You don't have to answer this," he said eventually. "But how close is it with the bank?" She looked at him. 60 days. 52 now. "And if you sell the cattle at market?" "Short, not by a little." He was quiet. She could tell he was running numbers in his head count weight, price per pound, the arithmetic of survival. She waited. "How many head did you start with?" he said. "Last spring." 112. Something moved across his face. Not pity, which she would have resented, but something closer to anger on her behalf, which she found she could tolerate. What happened to them? Some died in the spring freeze. Some I sold to cover operating costs when Thomas got sick. Some I sold to pay for the funeral. She said it all flatly, not looking for sympathy. "The ones that are left are healthy. They're just not enough." Jake set down his water glass. "There's a buyer's market coming up in Abilene in 6 weeks. I know a broker there, man named Hector Van. He's fair, and he gets a better price per head than most. If we push the cattle into condition before then—" she said quietly. He met her eyes. "If you want. I know the route. I know the buyer. And I know cattle." She should have said, "I'll think about it." She should have been cautious, practical, measured. Instead she said, "Why, you said you had a name in Amarillo. Why are you still here?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the water glass in his hand, then back at her. And for a moment, in the thin light of the kitchen window, his expression was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Not careful, not composed, just honest. "I don't know," he said. And she believed him. That was the thing. She believed it absolutely, and that more than anything else was what made her afraid. The next morning, Elijah Morse came back. He arrived early enough that Cody was still at breakfast, and he didn't come alone this time. There was another man with him, better dressed than Morse, with the particular bearing of a man who was used to owning rooms. He climbed down from a fine horse with the smooth ease of someone who had never in his life worried about whether his boots would last another year. Margaret came out onto the porch, and Jake came out of the barn at the same time, and she was aware of Morse clocking Jake's presence, filing it, deciding something about it. "Mrs. Sullivan," Morse said. "I'd like to introduce Bill Carver. He's expressed an interest in—" "I know who Bill Carver is," Margaret said. Carver smiled. He was handsome in the way of men who'd been told so often enough that it had shaped them. He had a wide smile that went all the way up, but not quite all the way to his eyes. "Margaret Sullivan, your husband was a good man. I was sorry to hear about his passing." "Were you?" "I was." He looked around the property, not covertly but openly, the frank appraisal of a man who's calculating what something is worth and doesn't particularly care if you see him doing it. "I'd like to talk to you about a business proposition. Something that might benefit you considerably given your current situation." "My current situation," she said carefully, "is my business. Of course." The smile didn't waver. "But sometimes a neighbor can make a difficult situation less difficult. I've been looking to expand my grazing land north of the Pecos, and this property—" He paused, and the pause was weighted. Well, it's positioned well. I'd offer a fair price. More than fair. It's not for sale. Carver looked at Morse, then back at her. I'd encourage you to think about it carefully before. I have thought about it, she said. It took me about 4 seconds. The answer is no. A long pause. Carver's smile remained, but something behind it changed a slight cooling, like a cloud moving across the sun. Well, he said, that's your right, of course. He glanced at Jake, who had come to stand at the edge of the yard, not close enough to be threatening, just present. And you are, he said to Jake, with the confident tone of a man who expects answers. Jake met his eyes calmly. Jake Ryland. You work here? I do. Carver looked at him for a moment longer than was polite. Then he looked back at Margaret. Think on it, Margaret. 60 days is not a long time. He touched his hat, climbed back on his horse, and rode out with Morse following behind. Jake waited until they were off the property. Then, you know him. I know of him, she said. He owns about 40,000 acres south of here. He's been buying up smaller ranches for 2 years. Most of them he didn't have to push very hard. People were already struggling, and his offers were the easiest way out. She watched the dust settle where their horses had been. He's never pushed me directly before. He's always gone through Morse. Jake was quiet. He came himself this time. He came himself this time, she repeated. They stood in the yard together, looking at the empty road. Something was changing. She could feel it the way you feel, weather before it arrives. A pressure shift, a certain quality to the air. Margaret, Jake said. I know, she said. I know. She found Thomas's ledger that night, the original one from the year they signed the note. She'd been through it before, right after he died, but she'd been grief-blurred then, and she'd been looking for different things. Now she looked for the interest rate. 6%. Clear as anything. Thomas's handwriting, the date, the amount, the terms. 6%. She sat back and stared at the ceiling. The bank's paperwork said 8. 2 full percentage points. On a loan that size over the life of the note, that difference was not small. That was not a clerical error. That was a decision someone had made and put on paper and sent to a widow and hoped she wouldn't notice or wouldn't push back. She was going to push back. She found Jake on the porch. It was late. Pete and Cody had been asleep for an hour. She came out and sat down on the porch step and spread the ledger open on her knee and held it in the moonlight and showed him. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Who would have changed it? He said finally. I don't know. Morse maybe, or someone above Morse. She closed the ledger. But if I can prove it, if I can find anyone else with a note from that bank who had the same thing happen, then it's not an accident. Then it's not an accident, she said. Then it's something else. Jake was looking at the road again. Carver came to you through the bank, he said slowly. If the bank is squeezing people out, adjusting the terms until they can't pay, then pushing them toward a sale. Carver gets the land at distressed prices, she finished. And the bank gets what a cut of the sale. An arrangement. They looked at each other in the dark. The night pressed in around them, hot and vast and very quiet. I need to find a lawyer, she said. I know one in Abilene, he said, when we take the cattle. That's weeks away. I know. He paused. Are you scared? She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said, but I'm also angry. And when I'm angry, I don't seem to be able to stay scared at the same time. I haven't figured out if that's a strength or a problem. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. In my experience, he said, it depends on the situation. She looked at him. He looked at her. The night was very still. Go to sleep, Jake, she said softly. You too, Margaret, he said. She went inside. She did not sleep for a long time, but when she did, she slept better than she had in 14 months. 3 days later, Cody came back from town with news that hit the yard like a stone into still water. He came in fast. his horse's sides heaving, and the look on his face. Cody, who was 19 and tried to look unruffled at all times the way young men did, the look on his face was something Margaret had not seen there before. "What happened?" she said. "Patterson's ranch." He was trying to catch his breath. "Dale Patterson. You know him, the one with the quarter section south of here, been there 30 years. I know him. What happened?" Cody looked at her, then at Jake, then back at her. "Bank sent men this morning. Not just Morse men. With papers in a wagon. They gave Dale 2 hours to take what he wanted, and then they changed the locks." Silence. "He didn't have 60 days, Jake said. "Dale says he had 60 days. Says he had 40 days left. Says the papers the bank sent him this morning said he'd defaulted early, some clause in the fine print about a missed payment in March. Dale says he didn't miss a payment. He has the receipts." Cody finally swallowed. "But they came anyway, and Dale's 58 years old, and there was nobody there to—" He stopped. His voice had gone tight. "He's in town now, at the general store. He's got nowhere to go." Margaret's hands were completely still at her sides. She turned and walked into the house, came back out 30 seconds later with the ledger and a piece of paper with Thomas's original loan terms. She held them up. "Jake," she said, "I need to get to that lawyer sooner than Abilene." He looked at her. "There's a man in Fort Stockton, retired judge named Harlan Webb. He's not cheap, but he's honest, and he's not afraid of banks." "How do you know him?" "He's my uncle," Jake said. She blinked. It was the first personal thing he'd offered her entirely unsolicited, and it surprised her enough that for a moment she forgot to be afraid. "Your uncle is a retired judge." "He is." "And you've been working ranch hands your whole life." "He didn't ask me to follow his path," Jake said simply. "And I didn't ask him. We get along fine because of it." Margaret looked at the ledger in her hand, then at Jake, then past him at the road that led toward town, toward Patterson sitting in the general store with his whole life behind him and nothing in front. "Can you get a letter to Fort Stockton by end of week? I can ride there myself and be back in 4 days." "I can't ask you to." "You didn't ask," he said quietly. "I'm telling you what I can do." She held his gaze. There it was again, that thing she couldn't name, and wouldn't let herself name the thing she'd been careful around every day for 2 weeks now. He stood in front of her in the morning heat of a West Texas summer, steady as the ground under her feet, and she thought, "I cannot afford this. I cannot afford to trust this." And then she thought, "I am going to have to anyway." "Go," she said. He was already moving. Jake rode out before the sun was fully up, and Margaret stood in the yard and watched the dust settle behind him, and told herself the hollow feeling in her chest was practical concern. Concern about the ledger, the lawyer, the 40 days Dale Patterson had lost without warning. It was not about the man riding away. She was certain of that. She was almost certain of that. Pete came up beside her. He didn't say anything. Pete was good at that, standing next to you without requiring anything from you. "He'll be back," Pete said finally. "I know he will." 4 days, he said. I heard him. Pete was quiet again. Then, he fixed the secondary pump yesterday before he left. The one behind the south trough. I didn't ask him to. Margaret turned and looked at the south trough. "I know," she said. "I noticed." She went inside and made a list of everything that still needed doing before the Abilene drive. It was a long list. She went to work. The first day without Jake was fine. The second day was fine too if she didn't think about it too carefully. She had plenty to occupy her. The cattle needed moving to better grazing on the east side of the property. The account books needed updating, and she'd decided to ride into town herself and find Dale Patterson, because Dale Patterson was her neighbor, and he was 58 years old, and sitting in a general store with nowhere to go, and she was not the kind of woman who could let that stand without at least sitting down beside it. She found him at the back of Harris's store on a barrel, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hand, and the look of a man who had not yet found the shape of what had happened to him. Dale was broad-shouldered and sun-weathered, the kind of man who had built things his whole life, and the smallness of the space he occupied now hunched on that barrel in the back corner of a general store, made Margaret's chest hurt in a way she wasn't prepared for. "Dale?" She sat down across from him on a feed sack. "Tell me what happened." He told her. She listened without interrupting, which was what he needed, not solutions yet, not comfort, just to be heard completely. He'd been at the bank in March, he said, same as every month, and he'd paid. He had the receipt. He carried it in his shirt pocket right now, the paper soft with handling, because he'd looked at it so many times since morning, trying to make it explain something. But the bank's papers said the payment had never been recorded, said it had been returned for insufficient funds, but his account had had the money in it he knew it had, he could prove it. "Do you have your bank statements?" Margaret asked. "At the house, which I can't." He stopped. "I don't have the house." She reached out and put her hand over his. He was 60 years old, and he didn't cry, but his jaw worked for a moment before he got it under control. "I'll send Cody to get them," she said. "Today, right now, before they change the locks on anything else." She stood up. "And Dale, do you have family you can stay with just for now?" "My daughter in San Angelo." "Go to her, not forever, just until we sort this out." He looked up at her. "You think there's something to sort?" "I think the bank told me my interest rate was 8% when Thomas signed for 6%, she said. "And I think they came to your property 20 days before your deadline. And I think Bill Carver has been buying land all across this county for 2 years. She said it quietly, evenly. "So yes, I think there's something to sort." Something came back into Dale's eyes then, not hope exactly, but the precursor to it. The awareness that a thing might not be entirely over. "Thomas always said you were the sharpest one of the two of them," he said. "Thomas was generous." "Thomas was honest," Dale said. "Wasn't a generous bone in the man. You know that." She laughed short and unexpected, and it surprised them both. "Yeah," she said, "I know that." She sent Cody to Patterson's ranch that afternoon, with instructions to get the bank statements and anything else that looked like paperwork before the bank sent anyone back. Cody was back by evening with a flour sack full of documents and a story about finding 2 men from the bank already there, walking the perimeter, which meant somebody had moved fast. Margaret spread everything on the kitchen table that night and went through it page by page. By midnight, she had it. Right there in Dale's statements, the March payment cleared and recorded on March 14th. Then, 11 days later, a notation she almost missed payment returned. NSF. No explanation. No correspondence. Just a retroactive reversal of a payment that had already cleared. She sat back and looked at the ceiling. Someone at the bank had gone into the record and changed it. This was not sloppiness. This was not a clerical error. This was deliberate, and it had taken someone with access to the bank's internal accounts. Someone who knew how to make it look like a mistake after the fact. Someone who... She heard hoofbeats outside fast, and she was on her feet and at the door before she'd fully decided to move. But it was only Cody's voice from the yard. "Mrs. Sullivan, it's okay, it's just Mr. Ryland." She exhaled. Jake came through the door, still trail-dusty hat in hand, and stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" "You said 4 days," she said, and her voice came out sharper than she intended. "I rode faster." He looked at the papers spread across the table. "What is that?" "Dale Patterson's bank statements." She stepped back so he could see. "Look at March 14th. He came to the table and looked. She watched him read it. Watched the moment he found the reversal, the slight change in his posture, the stillness that moved through him. "That cleared," he said. And then it didn't. He looked up. "Someone changed it. Someone changed it." He put his hat on the table and pulled out a chair and sat down. "My uncle is coming," he said. She stopped. "What?" "Harlan, he's coming here. I told him what you told me, and I told him about Patterson, and he said..." Jake paused, and she could tell from his expression that whatever his uncle had said had surprised even him. "He said he'd been waiting for something like this. Said he'd heard things over the years about the Stockton Savings Bank and some of the ranches around here. Said he'd tried to look into it twice, and both times the trail went cold. He met her eyes. He's coming, Margaret. He'll be here in 3 days. She stood very still. Your retired judge uncle is traveling 3 days to come to my kitchen table. He's not just a retired judge, Jake said. He spent 20 years before that as a federal land attorney. He knows land fraud the way you know cattle. The word fraud landed on the table between them, and neither of them looked away from it. If we can prove it, she said. If we can prove it, he said. And we might be able to. Harlan Webb arrived on a Wednesday in a buggy driven by a young man who turned out to be his clerk, and he was nothing like what Margaret had expected. She'd pictured someone who looked like Jake, or like an older version of Jake, hard-worn, quiet, economical. Instead, Harlan Webb was short and round, and wore a remarkable pair of spectacles with thick lenses that made his eyes look slightly too large for his face. And he came through her door. Talking had apparently been talking for the last 3 miles, and didn't stop until he'd sat down, accepted coffee, and spread his own papers across the table alongside hers. You're smarter than most, he said to Margaret by way of greeting. Because you kept the original ledger. Most people don't keep the original ledger. They keep the bank's copy, and the bank's copy is the problem. You kept Thomas's own record. That's your leverage right there. He picked up Dale Patterson's statements and held them up to the light like he was checking currency. And this is either the sloppiest fraud in Crockett County or the most arrogant one. I'm guessing arrogant. Arrogant is better for us. Arrogant people make mistakes because they stop being careful. How many ranches do you think are involved? Jake asked. Can't say yet. But I'll tell you what I know about Carver. Harlan set the papers down and looked at both of them over his spectacles. Bill Carver has been acquiring land in this county for 3 years. In those 3 years, 14 properties have sold to him, most of them under duress. 7 of those sales came within 90 days of the seller falling into arrears with the Stockton Savings Bank. Now is that proof of collusion numb? Is it a pattern that a court would find interesting? Absolutely yes. Margaret was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me? Everything Thomas ever signed with the bank. Every letter, every receipt, every statement. I need a list of every neighbor you can think of who's had trouble with the bank in the last 3 years. And I need you to stay very quiet about all of this. No confrontations, no accusations, nothing that gives them warning. We're building something. She almost laughed at that. Elijah Morse was already here. And Carver came himself. Harlan raised an eyebrow. Carver came to your property with Morse 3 weeks ago. Harlan and Jake looked at each other. Something passed between them. She didn't fully understand it, but she understood its weight. They're moving faster than I thought, Harlan said. Why would they move faster? He looked at her steadily. Because you pushed back on the interest rate. Because you didn't sell. You've become a problem, Margaret. And when people like Carver have a problem, they don't wait. It was Harlan who discovered the connection to the clerk. He'd been at the bank records working through channels that Margaret didn't fully understand. Old relationships with county officials, a land registry contact in Austin, and on the second day of his visit, he came back to the kitchen table at supper time and put a name in front of her. Gerald Height, the bank's records clerk. I know Gerald, she said immediately. Young man, Thomas dealt with him when we signed. Gerald Height has been at the Stockton Savings Bank for 4 years, Harlan said. He has a salary that does not account for the house he bought 18 months ago. He has an account at a different bank, a private account in his wife's maiden name, that shows a series of deposits, irregular amounts, always in cash starting about 2.5 years ago. He paused. Always within a week of a property transaction going through to Carver. The room was absolutely quiet. He's the one making the changes to the records, Margaret said. I believe so. I can't prove it yet, but I believe so. Can you get to him? Jake said. I don't want to get to him, Harlan said. I want him to get to us. If Height is scared enough and smart enough, he'll know that his usefulness to Carver ends the moment there's an investigation. And the thing about men like Height, Harlan picked up his coffee. Is that they make these arrangements because they're greedy, but they maintain them because they're afraid. And afraid men, given the right opening, will choose to protect themselves. Margaret looked at Jake. Jake looked at her. You want to create pressure, Jake said. I want to let him know quietly through channels he can't immediately identify that someone is looking. That there are people comparing records. That this is not going to stay buried. Harlan set down his coffee. And I want to see what he does. What Gerald Haight did, it turned out, was panic. He came to the ranch on a Thursday morning without Morse, without Carver by himself on a horse he wasn't confident on. He came up the drive with the particular manner of a man doing something he has already deeply regretted, but cannot find a way to stop doing. Margaret saw him coming and went to the door and waited. He climbed down. He was maybe 25 with fair hair and the kind of soft-faced good looks that hadn't yet been tested by anything serious. He was tested now. His shirt was damp at the collar, even though it wasn't yet warm. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, I need to talk to you. She stepped onto the porch and let him stand in the yard. You're talking. He looked around, checking whether anyone was watching. Jake was in the barn. She'd asked him to stay there for now. I know that someone has been asking questions. About the bank's records. About me. He swallowed. I need to know who it is. Why? Because. He stopped. Started again. Because I may have some information that would be useful. To whoever is asking. She studied him. He was terrified. Not of her, of what was already in motion, the thing he'd felt approaching for days and couldn't stop. What kind of information? About how the records were changed. About who directed it. He looked at her directly for the first time, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't expected, not just fear, but something that might have been shame. I didn't start this, he said. I want you to know I didn't start this. Morse came to me and said it was a routine adjustment, a correction, and by the time I understood what I was actually doing, he stopped. I have a family, Mrs. Sullivan. She was quiet for a long moment. Every part of her wanted to tell him that she had no sympathy for him, that Dale Patterson had a family too, that Thomas had been her family, that the men and women whose properties had been stripped away all had families. She didn't say any of that. Not yet. There's a man staying here, she said instead. A lawyer, a former federal land attorney. He'd like to speak with you. She paused. Formally, with an agreement about your cooperation written down before you say a word. Haight went slightly pale. Of federal? Yes. He was silent for a long moment. Then quietly, all right. She called for Jake to bring Harlan. Harlan sat with Haight for 2 hours in the kitchen, while Margaret and Jake waited on the porch. She could hear the murmur of voices through the window. Not the words, just the rhythm of them. Harlan steady and measured Haight's starting fast and gradually slowing, like a man bleeding pressure from a valve. She sat on the porch step, with her hands folded, and did not allow herself to feel anything in particular, because she was not yet sure there was anything solid enough to feel it about. Jake sat above her on the porch rail. He was quiet. He'd been quiet in the particular way he got when he was thinking something through rather than resting a quality of attention in the stillness rather than absence from it. If Haight gives us Morse, Jake said without preamble, then we have the bank's direct involvement. And Morse won't want to go down alone. No, she said. He won't. Carver's insulated. That's how these things work. The man at the top keeps his hands clean. Morse talks to Haight, Carver talks to Morse, and Carver's name is never on any of the papers that mean anything. But if Morse talks, Jake said, then Carver's got a problem. He was quiet again. Then, are you prepared for how hard he'll push back? If he feels the ground moving under him, he won't just let it go. Men like Carver, I know, she said. I know what men like Carver do. She looked at her hands. Thomas used to say the difference between a man who'll do something wrong and a man who won't isn't capability. It's how much they believe they're untouchable. She paused. Carver believes he's untouchable. Until he doesn't. Until he doesn't, she agreed. The door opened, and Harlan came out alone. He looked at both of them over those remarkable spectacles and said with the careful neutrality of a man who had trained himself not to show excitement, "He'll cooperate. He has 3 years of records. He knows where the physical documents were altered, and he kept copies he was never supposed to have as his own insurance." He paused. "He's been holding them for 2 years trying to decide what to do with them." Silence. 3 years, Margaret said. 3 years of altered records, forged payment reversals, and in 4 cases fabricated loan default clauses that were inserted into contracts after signing. Not in the original documents in the bank's copies, the ones they keep. He looked at her. Thomas's original ledger becomes critical, Margaret, because it shows what the original terms were before the bank's copy was changed. She thought about Thomas sitting at this table signing that paper, trusting that the number he put his name to was the number that would stay. She thought about him dying without knowing what had been done to it after. She pressed her hands flat on the porch boards. "I want it on record," she said. Her voice was steady. "Not just fixed. On record. I want the county to know what was done here." Harlan nodded. "That's the plan." 3 days after Height's visit, a man Margaret didn't recognize rode onto the property and said he had a message from Bill Carver. He didn't say this to Margaret, he said it to Jake, who was the first person he saw, and that was its own kind of message. He handed over a folded note and rode back out without waiting for a response. Jake brought it to Margaret. She read it. Carver's handwriting was neat, controlled the penmanship of a man who valued the appearance of precision. The note said simply that he understood she might have concerns about her financial situation, that he remained open to a conversation, that his original offer stood, and that he sincerely hoped she would make a decision in her own best interests before the situation became more complicated than it needed to be. She read it twice, then she put it on the table in front of Harlan. Harlan read it, set it down, and said, "He knows." "He knows," Jake said. "He knows Height talked to someone. He doesn't know who or what was said. This is a probe he's testing, whether you'll react, whether you'll reach out to him, whether he can see what you have." Harlan took off his spectacles and cleaned them, which she'd come to understand was what he did when he was deciding something. "Do not respond. Do not acknowledge the note. Treat it as if it never arrived." "And when he comes himself," Margaret said. "He will come himself," Harlan said. "And when he does, you let me handle it." Jake was looking at the note. Something in his jaw had set in the way it did when he was angry, and not expressing it. "How much time do we have before he does something other than notes?" Harlan put his spectacles back on. "Not long," he said honestly. He was right. The cattle came in late that Friday, late, and wrong bunched too tight at the south fence, making the particular distressed sound that cattle made when something had moved them hard. Cody rode out and came back in 20 minutes looking pale. "The south fence," he said. "It's down, not just down cut. Clean through the wire." Jake was already standing up. "How many head are past the line?" "Maybe 8-10. They're not far, but they're heading toward Carver's territory." The thing about losing cattle across a property line was that it was never simple. Cattle that crossed were technically trespassing, and a man like Carver with a grudge and a lawyer would find a way to complicate retrieval, to claim damages to hold the animals until a dispute that served him could be manufactured. Jake knew it. She knew it. They were both moving before Cody finished the sentence. Jake rode ahead. Margaret followed on her own horse, a rangy gray she'd had for 6 years, who didn't waste energy on drama. Pete stayed back with Cody to manage the rest of the herd. They found the cattle a half-mile past the cut fence, grazing peaceably in the long grass, as though they had no idea the world was complicated. Jake swung wide to the left, and she took the right, and they moved together without talking, falling into the rhythm of it. Two people who had spent enough time working cattle together that the coordination happened on its own. They had 8 of the 10 back across the line when two riders appeared on the ridge above them. Margaret recognized them by their horses before she could see their faces. Carver's men, she'd seen them at his property once at a cattle auction 2 years ago, hard-faced men in good gear who had the watchful stillness of people paid to be present rather than to work. They didn't come down. They just sat on the ridge and watched. Jake looked up at them. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just held their gaze for a moment, unhurried, unafraid, with the particular quality of stillness that she had come to understand was not passivity, but its opposite, and then he turned his horse and went back for the last 2 cattle. When they had all 10 back, and the cut fence temporarily lashed with spare wire, she pulled her horse alongside his. "They were counting them," she said. "Counting the cattle." "Yes." They knew exactly where to cut the fence. "Yes." She looked back at the ridge. The riders were gone. "Jake?" "I know. He's going to hit us harder than cut fences." Jake turned to look at her, and she held the look, and she saw in his face that he was weighing something, not whether to tell her, but how. "Margaret," he said, "I need to tell you something about why I was traveling when I came here. The work in El Paso that fell through." She waited. "I was doing contract work," he said, "for a land title company, investigating a fraudulent deed scheme. Small 1-3 properties 1 county over. The man behind it had Carver's name in his ledger." She went very still. "What?" "Consulting fees paid to a B. Carver, Crockett County." He held her eyes. "I didn't know if it was the same man until I got here and you described him in the way he operates, but I knew the name." He paused. "That's partly why I stayed." The world around her was very quiet for a moment. Wind. The sound of cattle settling. "Partly," she said. He didn't look away. "Partly," he said. She'd asked for honesty, and he was giving it to her. And it landed exactly the way true things do, harder than comfortable, and somehow more valuable for that. "You should have told me sooner," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have. She turned her horse back toward the house. She heard him follow. She didn't say anything else until they were back in the yard. And then she said, "Tell Harlan tonight. Everything. The El Paso job, the name in the ledger, all of it." "I will." "And Jake." She stopped. Turned to look at him one more time. The late afternoon light was hard and flat and honest. "I'm not angry. I want you to know that. I understand why you waited." She paused. "But no more waiting." He met her eyes steadily. "No more waiting," he said. She nodded and went inside. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment, with her hand flat on the table, breathing. Then she put water on the stove for coffee, opened the account book, and went back to work. Because there was still so much to do, and the 60 days were becoming 40, and somewhere out there, Bill Carver was recalculating. And the only thing she had ever known to do with a man who was recalculating how to take something from her was to move faster than he did. She moved faster. Harlan listened to everything Jake said without interrupting once, which Margaret had come to understand was the lawyer's version of alarm. When Jake finished the El Paso job, the ledger with Carver's name, the consulting fees, all of it laid out on the kitchen table alongside Dale Patterson's documents and Thomas's original loan record. Harlan took off his spectacles and set them down very carefully and looked at the wall for a long moment. Then he said, "You should have told me this 3 days ago." "I know," Jake said. "This changes the scope considerably." Harlan picked his spectacles back up. "A fraudulent deed scheme in El Paso with Carver's name in the ledger that's not county jurisdiction anymore. That's potentially federal land fraud. That's a different category of case, different courts, different consequences." He looked at Jake steadily. "And it means Carver has been doing this longer than we thought, in more places than we thought, and he's still walking around free. Which means he's been very careful, or very protected, or both." "Both," Jake said. "The man in El Paso, his name was Driscoll Thomas. Driscoll, he took the conviction alone, never gave Carver's name in court. The ledger entry was the only connection, and it was indirect enough that the prosecution didn't pursue it. Driscoll protect him deliberately. Driscoll was scared," Jake said simply. "He had a wife and 2 sons. Carver visited him the week before trial. Nothing was said directly, nothing that could be repeated. But Driscoll stopped talking and took his sentence, and Carver's name stayed out of it. Margaret had been listening from the other end of the table. "And you knew all of this," she said, not with accusation, just with the weight of it, "when you rode onto my property with a lame horse." Jake looked at her. "I knew Carver operated in this county. I didn't know whose land he was going after. I didn't know it was yours until I was already here, and you described Morse and the interest rate, and I started putting it together." He paused. "The horseshoe was real, Margaret. That part was just bad luck and good timing." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned to Harlan. "What do we do with the El Paso connection?" "We use it," Harlan said, carefully. "If I can get the El Paso case records, if I can find the ledger entry Jake is describing and connect it to the pattern we're building here, altered bank records, forced sales, Carver's acquisitions, then we have something much larger than one county's worth of fraud." He stood moving toward his papers with the focused energy of a man who has just found the shape of something he's been looking for. "I need to write some letters tonight, and I need you both to understand that from this point forward, Carver is not just a man trying to buy your land. He is a man who has a great deal to lose, who has demonstrated he will protect himself, and who now has reason to believe that people on this property know things that could destroy him." The kitchen was very quiet. "How much danger?" Margaret said. Harlan looked at her over his spectacles with the honest eyes of a man who respected her enough not to soften it. "Enough that I'd like Jake to stay close." She nodded once. "He's staying." Jake didn't say anything, but she felt him look at her, and she kept her eyes on Harlan, because there were things she could acknowledge directly and things she needed to let pass without examination, and that look was one of the latter. The drought broke on a Saturday, and it broke badly. Not the gentle soaking rain that the cattle needed, that the cracked earth had been aching for. It came in fast and violent the way West Texas storms always did, like something that had been patient too long and then stopped being patient all at once. Margaret heard it coming before she saw it, a low-frequency pressure change that she'd learned over years of living on open land. The kind of thing you felt in your back teeth before your ears registered sound. By the time the first lightning hit, the sky had turned the particular greenish black that meant they were in for something serious, and the cattle were already moving wrong, spooked bunching starting to run without a direction. "Pete." She was already in the yard. "Get Cody and push them into the south pen. Don't try for the barn, just get them contained." Jake was coming out of the bunkhouse pulling his jacket on. He read the situation in one look. "I'll take the east side. The new calves are in the far pen. I'll get them." He was already moving. She took the north side herself, working her gray through the dark and the first hard sheets of rain pushing cattle that didn't want to be pushed, her voice going raw from calling out directions that Pete could barely hear over the wind. Lightning walked across the sky in great white forks, and each crack of thunder sent the cattle into fresh panic, and she pressed her horse forward, because there was nothing else to do. Because this was what it meant to own this land. Not the good days, but this. The moments when everything tried to come apart at once, and the only answer was to stay in it. She had the north group moving toward the pen when her horse stumbled. Not a fall, the gray caught itself, scrambled, found footing. But Margaret lurched hard to the left and grabbed the saddle horn, and for one long, terrible second, she was half off the horse in the rain, and dark with cattle thundering 10 feet away, and everything in her went quiet, with a specific animal fear that was different from any of the other fears she'd been living with for weeks. Then a hand closed on her arm. Jake's hand, his grip absolutely certain, pulling her back upright in the saddle, without breaking pace, his horse close enough to hers that she could feel the animal's warmth through the rain. "I've got you," he said. Not loud, calm, like a fact. She got her seat back. They pushed the cattle the last 100 yards together, got the gate closed, and then stood in the rain on the other side of it. And she became aware that her hands were shaking. Not from cold, from the delayed arrival of what could have happened. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Rain running off the brim of his hat. "Don't thank me yet. We still have the calves." They rode for the far pen. Yeah, it took 2 more hours to secure every animal, and by the time they were done, the storm had moved on. The way West Texas storms did sudden departure, almost an apology. The damage was not catastrophic. 3 fence sections down on the east side. The roof of the small equipment shed had lifted and dropped back at an angle. The new calves were fine, all 7 of them crowded into the corner of the pen, with the damp and affronted look of the very young forced into unpleasant circumstances. Margaret and Jake stood in the yard afterward, soaked through catching their breath. Pete and Cody were checking the barn. Harlan, who was 70 years old and had the pragmatic self-knowledge to understand he could not help with cattle in a West Texas thunderstorm, had stayed inside and built up the fire and had coffee waiting when they came back in. She peeled off her wet jacket at the door. Jake did the same. They sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table with their coffee, and nobody said anything for a while, and the fire was warm, and the rain was still tapping against the windows on its way east, and it was the quietest Margaret had felt in weeks. "Harlan," she said finally, "did you get your letters written?" "Posted them with my clerk this afternoon before the storm," he said. "Austin and El Paso both." She nodded. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the table. She became aware in the particular way that exhaustion sometimes stripped away the careful management she kept in place, that she was glad Jake was sitting at the other end of the table. Not because she needed him there, because she was glad he was there. That was different. She'd been trying not to know the difference for several weeks now. She looked up and found him looking at her. They both looked away. Harlan pretended to read a document he was probably already familiar with. God, she couldn't sleep. She'd been sleeping better. She'd noticed it without wanting to notice it, the way the house felt less hollow since there were people in it. Again voices at supper. Pete's cough in the morning, that she'd grown oddly fond of Cody's 19-year-old enthusiasm for everything. Jake's low voice talking to the mayor in the mornings. But tonight she couldn't sleep because she kept returning to the moment on the horse, that second of hanging half off the saddle in the dark rain with the cattle going past, and she couldn't stop her mind from running the version where Jake's hand hadn't been there. She'd been running this ranch alone for over a year, and she'd told herself she could keep running it alone, and she believed that. She still believed it. She was not a woman who needed saving, but there was a difference she was discovering between needing something and wanting it. Between surviving alone and choosing not to. She got up, put water on the stove. She heard the porch boards flex, and then Jake's knock on the doorframe, the same careful courtesy he always showed announcing himself before entering, rather than walking in like he owned the place, which she'd noticed the very first night, and which she'd been quietly grateful for ever since. "You too," he said. "You too," she replied. He came in. Didn't sit down this time, leaned against the wall beside the window, arms crossed looking at the floor. She poured 2 cups when the water was ready and set one on the counter near him and sat down at the table with hers. "I keep thinking about that moment," she said. "On the horse." "I know. I do too. I've been on that horse in worse weather. I don't know why I—" She stopped. "You've been carrying a lot," he said, "for a long time. Sometimes the body just—" He stopped too. Neither of them seemed to be very good at finishing that particular sentence. The quiet stretched between them, but it was the kind of quiet that had texture to it now, weight and warmth. Outside, somewhere far off to the east, the last of the storm was still grumbling. "Jake," she said, "when this is over, when the case is made and the land is settled, what do you do?" He was quiet for a moment. "Depends on a lot of things. Name one." He looked up from the floor and met her eyes, and she held the look this time, instead of looking away, and the space between them, the kitchen table, the fire, the 2 cups of coffee felt very small suddenly. "Whether there's a reason to stay in this part of Texas," he said. She breathed, slow and careful. "That's not an answer." "No." He agreed. "It isn't." She should have left it there. She'd been leaving it there for weeks, each time it approached this edge, pulling back, keeping it practical, keeping it about the land and the bank and the case. But it was past midnight, and she was tired down to the bone, and her hands still weren't quite steady from the storm, and she said, "I buried Thomas on this property, buried him under the oak on the East Ridge. And I stood there on a November morning and told him that I would hold on to what we built, that I would not be pushed out of it." Her voice stayed even. She was proud of that. "I have been so focused on not being pushed out that I think I forgot to think about what comes after. What it looks like when you've held on and the fight is done and you're still here." She looked at her coffee. "I haven't let myself think past winning. Does that make sense?" "Yes," he said very quietly. "It makes sense." "I think I'm afraid," she said, "that after everything, I'll still be standing in the same place. Alone." The word landed and stayed. Jake didn't move. Then he pushed off from the wall and came to the table and sat down across from her, and he put his hands flat on the table, not reaching for her, not closing the distance, just present, close, deliberate. "Margaret," he said. She looked at him. "I'd trade 10 herds for one night with you." She went absolutely still. He said it quietly, the way he said everything. No performance in it, no dramatics. Just the plain, honest weight of it, like a man putting something down that he'd been carrying for a long time. His eyes didn't leave hers. "I've been trying to find the right time to say something, and I've kept deciding there was no right time, and then running out of time to decide, so I'm saying it now. I'd trade everything I have, which is not much, just for this. Just for you across a table from me. I'm not asking you for anything. I just wanted you to know that." The fire crackled. The last of the rain tapped twice against the window and then stopped. She looked at this man who had ridden in on a lame horse and stayed because, partly for professional reasons, she now understood, and partly because of something else she'd been watching build for weeks, quiet and solid and unhurried. She looked at his hands flat on the table, not reaching. She looked at his face open and undefended in a way she hadn't seen from him before, and she reached across the table and covered one of his hands with hers. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He turned his hand under hers and held on gently, the same grip he'd used in the storm, certain and careful, and they stayed like that in the quiet kitchen, while the fire burned low. And for the first time since Thomas died, Margaret Sullivan did not feel alone in the dark. She told herself in the morning that nothing had changed. This was not entirely honest, but it was the story she needed to tell herself in order to function, and she was practical enough to know that sometimes survival requires a certain selective clarity. She cooked breakfast. She reviewed the fence repair list with Cody. She went over Harlan's strategy with him while he ate, and she did all of this as herself, the same woman she had been yesterday. Jake worked. He didn't look at her differently in front of Pete and Cody and Harlan. He was simply there, the same way he'd been there for weeks, but now with the particular quality of a thing that has been named and acknowledged and can therefore rest without straining. She was grateful for that. More than she knew how to say. The first response to Harlan's letters came faster than any of them expected. 4 days after the storm, a rider arrived from Fort Stockton with a sealed envelope for Harlan. He read it at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold beside him, and when he finished, he set it down and looked at Margaret and said, "Austin knows." She stopped. "What do you mean Austin knows?" "I mean the Texas Land Office has an open inquiry, has had one for 7 months. He tapped the letter. "A land commissioner named Briggs Careerman, been there 20-some years. He's been watching a pattern of sales in several West Texas counties that looks very much like what we're describing. He's been building a case from the state side. He needs a witness from inside the county." He looked up. "He needs a primary victim who will stand up in court." Every person in the room was looking at Margaret. She felt the weight of it settle on her, not crushing, but substantial, real. This was different from fighting to save her own land. This was standing up in a court and saying what she knew with her name attached to it in front of Carver and Morse and whoever else's lawyers materialized. This was putting herself at the front of it. "How many families?" she said. "Briggs estimates 14 properties in confirmed cases, possibly more." Harlan picked up the letter. Most of them have already sold. Most of them are gone. They'd be witnesses too, but you—" He set it down again. "You're the one who still has the original documents. You're the one who never sold. You're the one who found the discrepancy and started pulling the thread." He paused. "And you're still here, on the land. That matters legally and practically." She thought about Dale Patterson on a barrel in the back of a general store with a cold cup of coffee. She thought about 14 families. She thought about Thomas's handwriting in the ledger, 6% clear and plain, and already betrayed by the time she found it. "Yes," she said. Harlan raised an eyebrow. "Just like that." "What did you want me to do? Think about it for a week." She picked up her own coffee. "Yes, I'll stand up. Tell Briggs yes." Carver moved 2 days later. She didn't know it was coming the way she'd felt the storm coming. It arrived without warning, a morning that started like any other morning. Pete at the stove, Cody bringing in the milk. Harlan's clerk copying documents at the table, while Harlan himself was still getting dressed. Then Cody opened the door and said in a voice that was trying very hard to be calm, "There's riders coming, a lot of them." She counted 6 as they came up the drive. Carver at the front on his fine horse Morse beside him, looking like a man who had been told to be there rather than a man who wanted to be there. And 4 others she recognized as men who worked Carver's southern ranch. Big men, hard-faced, carrying themselves like physical arguments. Jake was beside her before she reached the door. "Stay on the porch," he said quietly. "Not an order or request. Let him come to you." She stayed on the porch. Carver stopped his horse at the edge of the yard. He looked at the people assembled. Margaret, Jake, Pete appearing from the barn with his rifle resting in the crook of his arm, in a manner that was technically casual, and actually not Cody beside the house. Harlan, coming through the door behind Margaret, still tucking in his shirt. Carver looked at Harlan, and something moved across his face. Recognition. "Harlan Webb," he said. "Bill Carver." Harlan stepped up to the porch rail. "It's been a while." She looked at Jake. Jake looked at her. "They know each other." "Mrs. Sullivan," Carver said, pulling his attention back to Margaret. His voice was still smooth, still controlled, but underneath it there was something new, a tightness, the sound of a man who has run calculations and not loved the result. "I've been patient. I've offered you a fair price. I've given you time. I'm afraid we've reached the end of what I'm able to offer in good faith." "You've never acted in good faith," Margaret said. "Not once in any of this." His jaw tightened. "I'm going to need you to be reasonable. What you need," Harlan said from the porch, "is to turn those horses around. You are on private property. Your bank has altered loan documents, reversed verified payments, and engaged in coordinated fraud to force the sale of no fewer than 14 properties in this county, and we have the records to prove every word of that. Gerald Height has already spoken to me at length. I have documentation going back 3 years. And the Texas Land Office is expecting a full summary of what we have by the end of this week." The yard went very quiet. Morse beside Carver had gone the color of old ash. He looked like a man who had just understood something important and too late. Carver's expression didn't change exactly, but it contracted, everything pulled inward, calculating the public charm stripped back to something harder and less forgiving underneath. "You have nothing," he said. "A widow's ledger and the word of a bank clerk who falsified records himself." "I have the original loan agreement," Margaret said. "I have Thomas's handwriting at 6%. I have your records at 8. I have Dale Patterson's cleared payment reversed in your records 11 days after it cleared. I have a ledger from El Paso with your name in it filed as a consulting fee paid to you the week after Thomas Driscoll took a conviction for land fraud." She kept her voice level. Each sentence was a door closing. "Do you want me to keep going?" The mention of El Paso hit him. She saw it, a small, involuntary stillness, like a man who stepped on uncertain ground. Morse turned and looked at Carver with the expression of a man who has just discovered he didn't know everything he thought he knew. One of the riders at the back said something low to another, and Carver raised one hand sharply without looking back, silencing them. "This is not over," Carver said. "No," Harlan agreed pleasantly. "It certainly is not. The question is, how it ends, and what your role in that ending looks like. A man who cooperates with a state investigation has considerably better prospects than a man who rides to a private property with hired hands and makes threats in front of witnesses. He gestured mildly at the yard. Several witnesses. Carver looked at Harlan, then at Margaret, then for a long moment at Jake, and something in that look was specific, personal, the gaze of a man who has identified the source of his problem and filed it for later. Jake met it without expression. "Get off my land," Margaret said. Carver turned his horse. His men followed. Morse was last, and as he pulled his horse around, he looked at Margaret with an expression she hadn't expected. Not defiance, not contempt, but something closer to exhaustion. The look of a man who had made choices that had been compounding for years and could now see where they'd brought him. Then they were gone. The yard was quiet for 10 full seconds after the last horse disappeared down the road. Then Pete lowered his rifle and said, "Well," in the tone of a man who finds a single word sufficient for most situations. Harlan turned to Margaret. "That went better than I expected, and worse than I hoped." "What does that mean?" Cody asked. "It means we made our position clear, and he didn't call our bluff, which suggests we're right that he's more vulnerable than he's been acting. But it also means he's now going to make decisions under pressure, and men like Carver under pressure are unpredictable." He looked at Jake. The mention of El Paso was the right move. It told him his exposure is larger than this county. "He looked at you," Margaret said to Jake. "At the end." "Yes. He knows who you are, what you were doing in El Paso." "Probably." Jake was watching the road. "It means he'll try to find out what I have, what I gave to the title company, whether it's enough to connect him directly." "Is it?" He was quiet for a moment. "It's enough to make him afraid," he said. "And afraid men make decisions." Harlan finished. "The question is what kind." Margaret turned and went back into the house. She stood at the window and looked at the road, and the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since Carver's horse turned the look he'd given Jake direct, and measuring the look of a man who was identifying a problem to be solved. That question now had a sharper edge to it than she liked. She turned from the window. "Harlan, how long until we hear from Austin?" "A week, maybe 10 days." She nodded. 10 days. She could hold 10 days. She'd held 14 months. She would hold 10 days. But when Jake came inside an hour later and found her at the table with the ledger open in front of her, staring at Thomas's handwriting without actually seeing it, he came and stood beside her and didn't say anything. And she was glad for that, too glad he could read what she needed well enough to offer presence without performance. "He's going to come back," she said finally. "Yes," Jake said. "Not with 6 riders next time." "No," he agreed. "Not with 6 riders." She closed the ledger. "Then we have 10 days to make sure that when he does, we're ready." She said it calmly, practically the voice she used for making lists and plans and decisions. But Jake heard what was underneath it, the particular quality of a woman who has been pushed to the edge of what she can carry and has decided without dramatics, without asking permission to carry it anyway. He sat down beside her at the table, not across from her, beside her. She opened the ledger again and picked up the pen. They worked until midnight. The 10 days Harlan had estimated became 7 because the letter from Austin arrived early, and it arrived with weight. Margaret was at the south fence with Cody when Harlan's clerk rode out to find her, and she knew from the way the young man was riding fast, sitting forward, that whatever he carried mattered. She met him halfway across the yard, took the envelope, read it standing in the dust with Cody watching her face for information. Land Commissioner Briggs was coming personally. Not sending a deputy, not sending paperwork. Coming himself with 2 investigators from the state attorney's office arriving in 9 days. He had confirmed 14 properties under active inquiry. He needed Margaret's documents, Height's cooperation agreement, and Jake's testimony about the El Paso connection formalized in writing before his arrival. He also wrote in the careful language of a government official who chose words the way a man chose footing on uncertain ground, that the investigation had identified a possible political dimension to the case, that Carver's land acquisitions had been quietly facilitating a railroad right-of-way deal that involved at least one county commissioner and possibly a state-level official whose name Briggs was not yet prepared to put in writing. She read that paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter, put it in her jacket, and said to Cody, "Finish the south fence. I need to find Harlan." Harlan read the letter at the kitchen table without expression, which meant he was controlling his expression deliberately, which she'd learned to read as the legal equivalent of a man grabbing a saddle horn. "Railroad right-of-way," he said when he finished. "That's what he says. That changes everything." He set the letter down. If Carver's land scheme was feeding a railroad deal, if the properties he was acquiring were positioned along a planned route, then the motive isn't just greed, it's infrastructure. It's money on a scale that makes the individual ranch sales look like rounding errors. He looked up. And it means whoever is on the other side of that deal has considerably more to lose than Carver does, which means, "The political dimension," Jake said from the doorway. "The political dimension," Harlan confirmed. A county commissioner is one thing. A state official is another thing entirely. That level of exposure doesn't get managed quietly. It gets managed aggressively. He took off his spectacles. "Margaret, I need you to listen to me carefully. We are no longer dealing with a land dispute. We are dealing with something that reaches into Austin, possibly further, and the people involved have resources that Carver doesn't. The pressure from here forward is going to be of a different kind." She was quiet for a moment. "How different?" "The kind that doesn't ride up your driveway with 6 men and make speeches. The kind that works through lawyers and injunctions, and suddenly discovered legal irregularities in your own paperwork. The kind that is very hard to see coming." He paused. "And in the worst case, the kind that makes witnesses unavailable." The room was very still. "Witnesses unavailable," Margaret repeated slowly to make sure she understood what he was saying. "I'm not trying to frighten you more than the situation warrants," Harlan said. "But you deserve to know what you're standing in front of." She sat down. She pressed her hands flat on the table, her old habit grounding herself in the solid wood of it. She thought about Thomas, who had signed a paper in good faith and died not knowing it had been altered behind him. She thought about Dale Patterson on that barrel. She thought about 14 families scattered across West Texas counties, most of them already gone from the land they'd worked. "Tell me what we need to do," she said. "Copies," Harlan said immediately. "Every document we have 3 sets of copies sent to 3 different locations today. My office in Fort Stockton, Briggs's office in Austin, and someone you trust personally who is not connected to any of this professionally." He looked at her. "Is there someone like that?" she thought. "My sister in San Antonio." "Write to her today. Send the copies with Cody, not the mail Cody personally on a horse today." She was already standing. "Jake, will you help me copy the documents?" "Yes," he said. He was already moving toward the table. They worked for 3 hours straight, the two of them, and Harlan's clerk copying everything by hand, every bank statement, every letter. Thomas's ledger entries, Height's signed cooperation statement, Jake's written account of the El Paso connection. 3 complete sets. Margaret's hand ached by the end of it, and she didn't stop. Cody left for San Antonio before noon with a flour sack of documents and instructions to give them directly to her sister Eleanor, and no one else, and to tell no one where he was going. Margaret stood in the yard and watched him go, and she had the sudden acute awareness that she had just sent her youngest ranch hand, a 19-year-old boy, into motion as part of something that had grown considerably larger than a ranch and a bank loan. She felt the weight of that. She carried it. Papo. The first act of real violence came that night. Not at the house they'd been watching, the house, all of them, with the heightened alertness of people who know something is coming without knowing its shape. It came at the east pasture, where 17 of her best cattle were grazing. Pete heard the shots, first 2 of them, flat and distant from the east, and was at Margaret's door in the time it took most people to identify what they'd heard. Jake was already up. He'd been sleeping light for days. They rode out together, Pete and Jake and Margaret, and found 3 steers down, not scattered by a predator placed almost in a line along the fence. Shot deliberately. Clean shots close range. Someone who knew what they were doing, making a point rather than a profit. Margaret crouched beside the nearest animal and put her hand on its flank and felt the warmth still in it, and the stillness that was not sleep, and something moved through her that was not grief exactly. She'd moved past the luxury of grief in this particular moment. It was colder than grief and more focused. She stood up. "Pete, can you tell how long ago?" "Less than an hour," Pete said. "Maybe 40 minutes. She looked at Jake. "They're close." "They were close," he said. "They won't stay close." He was scanning the dark beyond the fence line, reading it the way he read everything carefully, without wasted motion. "This is a message, not an attack. If they'd wanted to do real damage tonight, they'd have hit more animals. They wanted me to know they can," she said. Yes. She stood in the dark pasture with 3 dead cattle and 48 days of everything at stake, and she felt the fear that Harlan had warned her about, the kind that was harder to see coming. And she felt it clearly and completely. And then she set it to one side, the way she set everything that she couldn't afford to indulge. "We move the cattle to the near pasture tomorrow," she said. "All of them. Closer to the house. Pete, I need you and Jake working the perimeter in shifts tonight. Don't go out alone." She paused. "And I'm writing to Briggs tonight. He needs to know the timeline has changed." Yeah. She wrote the letter to Briggs at midnight. Jake came in from the first perimeter check while she was finishing it, poured himself water. Sat down at the other end of the table. He had the manner of a man who was tired, but not going to say so. "How long have you been doing this?" she said without looking up from the letter. "This kind of work. Investigations." "Off and on 5 years. Before that, straight cattle work." "What changed?" He was quiet for a moment. "A man I worked for. Good man, built his ranch from nothing over 30 years. Lost it to a title dispute forged deed lawyer in his county who was in someone's pocket. By the time it was clear what had happened, the man was 64 years old, and there was nothing left to recover." He paused. "I watched that, and I thought someone should have caught it earlier. Someone should have been looking." She looked up from the letter. "So, you became someone who looks." "I tried to." She held his gaze. "You did more than try," she said. "You're here." He looked at her in the lamplight, with that expression she'd seen since the night of the storm, unguarded, honest, not asking anything. "I'm here," he agreed. She went back to the letter. She finished it and sealed it and set it with the documents for morning. Then she sat with her hands on the table and said without planning to, "I'm scared, Jake. I know. Not of Carver. Of the other thing, the thing behind Carver, the size of it." "That's the right thing to be scared of," he said. "Which means your fear is accurate, not excessive. That's different." She almost smiled. "That's an odd thing to find comforting." "You're an odd woman to try to comfort," he said, and his tone was warm enough that it wasn't an insult, and she did smile, then small and tired and real. "Get some sleep," she said. "You have the second perimeter." "You too." She went to bed. She slept 3 hours and woke with the dawn and went straight to work. Morse came alone 3 days later, and that was the first sign that the ground was shifting under him the way Harlan had predicted. He came without Carver, without riders, without the gray suit that was his armor. He came in a plain jacket, and he tied his horse at the gate himself instead of letting someone hold it, and he came to the porch with his hat in his hands and asked if he could speak with Harlan Webb. Margaret brought him into the kitchen. Harlan looked at Morse over his spectacles with the particular expression of a man who is reserving judgment about whether something is useful. "Mr. Morse, I need to talk to you about my position in this matter," Morse said. He sat down without being asked, which was so unlike his usual manner that it confirmed to Margaret that whatever was happening inside him was substantial. "I need to know what Height told you, and I need to know what kind of arrangement might be available to someone who—" He stopped, started again. "To someone who has information about the full scope of what's been done, not just the bank records, The larger arrangement. Harlan was very still. What larger arrangement? Morse put his hat on the table. He looked at his hands. Elijah Morse, who had come to her door 4 times with pale eyes and the posture of a man who had never in his life been uncertain, looked now like a man who had made calculations and found them all coming up short. "The railroad," he said. Harlan said nothing. "Carver's been acquiring the properties for the right-of-way route for 3 years, Morse said. The bank facilitated at altered terms. Manufactured defaults forced sales at below-market prices. Carver consolidates, then sells the right-of-way access to the railroad at full market rate. The profit margin on the arbitrage." He stopped. "It's considerable." "How many people know the railroad's involvement?" Harlan said. "At the bank level, just me and 2 board members. Carver kept it compartmentalized." He looked at Harlan. "At the state level, there's a man named Aldridge, Deputy Land Commissioner. He's been flagging competing land claims that might block the route, keeping the path clear officially while Carver clears it from the ground." The name landed on the table like a stone. Margaret looked at Harlan. Harlan's expression hadn't changed, but behind the spectacles, his eyes had sharpened into something that was not quite excitement and not quite alarm, but was in the territory between them. "Vernon Aldridge," Harlan said quietly. "You know him," Morse said. "I know the name," Harlan said in a tone that suggested he knew considerably more than the name. He stood up slowly and went to his papers. "Mr. Morse, I am going to ask my clerk to come in and take down everything you've just told me in formal statement. You are going to sign it. In exchange, I will advocate to Commissioner Briggs for the most favorable interpretation of your cooperation. I will not promise you immunity that is not mine to give, but I will tell you truthfully that a man who walks through the door with what you've just described before, he is compelled to stand in a materially different position than a man who is subpoenaed." He looked at Morse directly. "Do you understand?" "Yes," Morse said. "And Carver doesn't know you're here?" "No." "Make sure it stays that way until Briggs arrives." Harlan turned. "Margaret, would you mind asking Thomas to come in?" He meant his clerk. She went. When she came back, she stopped in the hallway just outside the kitchen and pressed her back against the wall and breathed for a moment. Vernon Aldridge, a deputy land commissioner. This had just become something that could shake Austin, could shake the entire structure of how land moved in this state, could reach places that Carver himself couldn't protect against. She heard Jake come up behind her. He'd been in the doorway the whole time. "Aldridge," she said quietly. "I heard. Harlan knows him." "Yes, and from the way he said the name." Jake paused. "He's been waiting for that name for a while." She turned to look at him. "How does your uncle know a corrupt deputy land commissioner?" "Harlan spent 20 years trying to clean up land fraud in this state," Jake said simply. "He's collected names the way other men collect debts. He knew who the players were. He just never had the evidence to touch them." She stared at him. "Jake, did Harlan come here just for me, or did he come here because this case is the thing he's been building toward for 20 years? Jake met her eyes steadily. "Both things can be true," he said. She absorbed that. It should have made her feel used a piece in a larger game she hadn't known she was in. Instead, it made her feel unexpectedly less alone. Like she hadn't been fighting this blind. Like there had been more people looking than she knew. "All right," she said. She straightened. "Let's go make sure Morse signs everything." Carver came back on a Thursday, and this time he didn't bring riders. He came alone, which was more frightening than 6 men, because a man who comes alone has decided that the situation has moved past the point where appearances matter. Jake saw him first. He came to find Margaret in the barn with 3 quiet words. "Carver's here, alone." She walked out. Carver was already off his horse, standing in the yard, and the careful composure that had always been his primary tool was gone, not replaced by anger exactly, but by something harder and less legible. He looked like a man who has discovered that the thing he built his sense of safety on has developed cracks, "Where is Morse?" he said. Not a question. "I don't know where Morse is," Margaret said. "He came here." "People come here," she said. "It's a ranch." Carver looked at her with the pale measuring attention of a man deciding something. "Whatever he told you, whatever arrangement you think you've made, you should understand that this goes higher than you know. Higher than Harlan Webb can reach, higher than whatever Austin contact you think you have. There are people involved in this who will not be inconvenienced by a widow's ledger and a frightened bank clerk." "Vernon Aldridge," she said. His face went very still. "We know," she said quietly. "We've known for 3 days, and Commissioner Briggs has known for longer than that." She watched him process this, watched the calculations running behind his eyes and coming up wrong. "You rode out here alone, Bill. You didn't bring lawyers, you didn't bring riders, which tells me you're not sure what Morse gave us. You're not sure what Aldridge has already said to protect himself, and you're not sure which way this falls." She took one step toward him. "Here's what I'll tell you for free. It falls on the truth. That's it. That's the only direction it goes." Jake was a few feet behind her and to the left. Harlan had appeared in the doorway of the house. Pete was at the barn with his rifle in exactly the same casual, not casual position as before. Carver looked at all of them. Then he looked at Jake, specifically the same look as before that personal measuring assessment. And he said, "Ryland, the title company in El Paso paid you off to bury what you found." Silence. Margaret didn't look at Jake. She kept her eyes on Carver. "That's a lie," Jake said from behind her. His voice was completely level. "Is it? Your contract was terminated. The case went nowhere. Driscoll took the conviction and your report disappeared, and you walked away with—" "My report didn't disappear," Jake said. "It's in Austin. It's been in Austin for 2 years in a file with Commissioner Briggs's office, submitted through Harlan directly after the title company closed the investigation. I knew the title company was compromised. I knew where the report needed to go instead." Another silence. Longer this time. Carver looked at Harlan. Harlan said pleasantly, "Hello, Bill." Something broke in Carver then, not dramatically, not with any sound. It was more like a structure settling the small adjustments of a thing that has been holding itself rigid for too long. He looked older suddenly. The confidence that had been his face for all of this, every visit, every smooth threat, every offer made in the language of reasonable men, it was gone, and what was underneath it was tired. He put his hat back on his head. He walked to his horse. He mounted. He looked at Margaret one more time. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "how much trouble you've brought on yourself." "I had trouble before you arrived," she said. "I'm still here." He rode out. The barn went up 4 days later. She was asleep when it started to smell. First smoke threading through the night. Then Pete's voice outside her window, terse and urgent. Then the orange light that turned the inside of her eyelids red before she was even fully awake. She was out of bed and out the door in 15 seconds. The barn was fully engaged on the north side, moving fast in the dry air, and the sound of it, that particular roaring crack of burning wood, was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. "The horses," she said. "Jake's already in there," Pete said. She ran. Jake had gotten 3 of the 4 horses out. The 4th, her gray, was in the back stall, terrified past reason, refusing to move. She could hear the gray screaming from the yard. She was through the barn door before anyone could stop her into the heat and smoke, keeping low the way she knew to do. And she found Jake at the gray stall, talking to the animal in a low, continuous voice, trying to get the blindfold on, that sometimes worked with panicked horses. "Give me the blindfold," she said. "Margaret. She knows my voice." She took it from him. She put her mouth close to the gray's ear and talked not words that meant anything, just sound, just her voice, the specific voice this horse had known for 6 years, and she got the blindfold on and got the lead on, and she said to Jake, "Take the lead, pull straight, don't stop." And he did, and the gray came. They got out 40 seconds before the north wall came in. She stood in the yard with the gray's lead in her hand and her lungs burning and watched her barn finish dying. Jake stood beside her. His shirt was scorched at the shoulder, and he was coughing, and he put his hand on her back and left it there, and she let him. "That wasn't an accident," Cody said from behind them. "No," she said. "It wasn't." Pete came up beside her. "Margaret, what do you want to do?" She looked at the barn. She thought about everything it had taken to build what she had here. Everything that had been stripped away since Thomas died. The cattle numbers, and the money, and the months, and now this. She felt the full weight of it. Let herself feel it completely, for exactly 10 seconds. The grief, and the exhaustion, and the fury, and the bone-deep unfairness of all of it. Then she said, "We save what we can tonight. In the morning I ride to find the county sheriff, and I file a report. And someone rides to the telegraph office and sends Briggs in Austin one word." "What word?" Cody said. "Now," she said. Briggs arrived in 5 days, not 9. He came with 4 men, 2 investigators, and 2 federal marshals, which told Margaret that the railroad connection had moved the case out of purely state jurisdiction and into something larger. He was a compact, gray-haired man in his 50s, with the no-nonsense bearing of someone who had spent a career navigating between powerful interests and had developed a particular form of patience that looked like calm but was actually precision. He sat at her kitchen table, the table that had held Thomas's ledger and Dale Patterson's statements and Height's signed cooperation and Morse's testimony and Jake's El Paso report and 3 sets of copies and 100 nights of coffee and fear and work, and he went through every document with his investigators while Margaret watched. When he finished, he looked at her over the documents and said, "Mrs. Sullivan, this is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of coordinated land fraud I have seen in 20 years. The majority of that documentation was assembled by you on this property while being actively pressured to sell." "I had help," she said. "I know." He looked at Harlan. "Harlan, it's been a long time." 15 years, Harlan said. "I thought you should know about the El Paso file." "You were right." Briggs looked at Jake. "Mr. Ryland, your report was the piece we needed to establish the pattern across counties. Without it, we had a local case. With it, we have a systematic scheme." He paused. "I want you to know that the title company that closed your investigation has itself been under inquiry for 18 months. 2 of its principals have already cooperated with federal investigators." Jake absorbed this without visible reaction. "And Aldridge." Briggs's expression didn't change. "Vernon Aldridge resigned his position 11 days ago. He is currently in discussion with the federal attorney's office about the terms of his cooperation." He paused. "He is not the only name that has come up at the state level. I will not burden you with the full scope of it today, but I want you to understand what you have built here has opened something considerably larger than this county." Margaret sat with that for a moment. She thought about Thomas signing a paper in good faith. She thought about 14 families. She thought about Dale Patterson on a barrel. "What happens to our land?" she said. "Mine and Dale Patterson's and the others." "Patterson's case is strong," Briggs said. "The manufactured default is clear in the records Height provided. He should be able to recover his property. The others, it depends on individual circumstances. Some sales will be harder to reverse, but the fraud invalidates the original loan terms across all affected properties, which means the bank's ability to enforce those loans is substantially compromised." He looked at her steadily. "Your land, Mrs. Sullivan, your loan at the corrected 6% rate with the payments you and your husband have made, you are not in default. You have never been in default. The bank's paperwork saying otherwise is itself fraudulent." He picked up one document, looked at it, set it down. "Barring something I cannot currently foresee, you keep your land." She sat very still. She'd known this was the likely outcome. She'd been working toward it for weeks, believing it was possible, telling herself it was possible. Hearing it said plainly by this man at this table was different from believing it. It hit somewhere below the practical level. She didn't cry. She'd cried for Thomas, for the cattle, for the barn, for all of it, in private, in the dark, in the way she allowed herself to process things that were too large for daylight. She didn't cry now. She just sat with it. Jake reached under the table and put his hand over hers for one brief moment. Private, not for the room, just for her, and then withdrew it. She pressed her palm flat on the table. Thomas's table. Her table. "All right," she said to Briggs. "Tell me what you need from me next." He opened his folder. She picked up her pen. Outside, Pete was already talking to Cody about salvaging the Barnes Foundation for a rebuild, his voice carrying its usual unhurried practicality through the window. The cattle were in the near pasture, all of them closer to the house where she could hear them in the morning. She had lost cattle, and money, and her barn, and 14 months of sleep, and more than she could easily count. She was still here. She put pen to paper and got to work. Briggs and his men stayed 4 days, and those 4 days had the particular quality of a held breath. Everyone moving carefully, speaking precisely, nothing wasted. The federal marshals set up a rotation around the property that Margaret hadn't asked for, and accepted without argument, because she was practical enough to know that pride about protection was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Carver was still out there. His lawyers were already moving. Harlan had heard from a contact in Fort Stockton that 2 attorneys from San Antonio had arrived in the county the day after Briggs, which meant Carver had known the state was coming and had prepared. Prepared men were dangerous. Cornered, prepared men were something else entirely. Briggs finished his interviews on the 3rd day. Margaret Jake Harlan Height by arranged meeting in town, and a deposition from Dale Patterson conducted at his daughter's house in San Angelo via a county official who rode out specially. On the 4th morning he came to the kitchen table for the last time and spread out a document that was not a request but a timeline. "Carver will be served with a formal notice of investigation this week," he said. "His attorneys will immediately file to suppress the bank records on the grounds that Height obtained and shared them without proper authorization. That motion will fail, I'm confident of that, but it will take time, and time is what they're buying." He looked at Margaret. "In the meantime, your loan status is being formally suspended pending resolution. The bank cannot foreclose, cannot issue new default notices, cannot act against your property in any capacity while the investigation is active." She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully realized she'd been holding. "How long is the investigation active?" "As long as it takes," Briggs said. "Could be months, more likely longer given the state-level dimension." He paused. "You should also know that 2 other affected families have come forward since word got out. A couple named Reyes lost their property 8 months ago. A rancher named Tolliver, whose sale we may be able to challenge if the timeline holds." He folded his hands on the table. "What you started here, Mrs. Sullivan, is still growing." She nodded. She didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that the documents on the table didn't already say more plainly. After Briggs left, the property felt different, quieter, in a way that wasn't peaceful but anticipatory, like the air before a second storm. The marshals left with him. Harlan stayed unwilling to go until he was certain the immediate pressure had passed. Jake stayed, which no longer required explanation from either of them. That night after supper, Pete did something he almost never did. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey from the bottle he kept for what he called serious occasions, and he poured one for Cody, and he looked at Margaret and said, "You too," in a tone that brooked no argument. He poured one for Jake, and one for Harlan, and he held up his glass and said nothing at all, because Pete had spent 60 years understanding that some moments didn't need words, and then they all drank. It was the best whiskey Margaret had ever tasted, and she was fairly certain it had nothing to do with the whiskey. 3 days after Briggs left, Carver made his last move against the property, and it came from a direction none of them had fully anticipated. It didn't come as riders or fire or cut fences. It came as a man Margaret had never seen before, arriving in a hired buggy with a briefcase and a card that identified him as an attorney named Prescott from a San Antonio firm. He presented himself to Margaret at the door with the polished courtesy of a man paid very well to be polished, and he handed her a document and said that he was sorry to inform her that a competing land claim had been filed against the Sullivan property, dating the claim to a survey conducted in 1871, prior to Thomas Sullivan's purchase in 1874, asserting that the original patent recorded in the county deed office contained an error in the boundary description that invalidated the subsequent sale. She took the document. She read it on the porch without inviting the attorney in. Then she looked up and said, "Who filed this claim?" "I'm not at liberty to." "Who filed this claim?" she said again with exactly the same inflection. The attorney adjusted his cuffs. The claim was filed by a landholding company called Pecos Valley Properties. "And who owns Pecos Valley Properties?" "That information is not—" "I know who owns it," she said. She handed the document back to him. "Tell your client that my attorney will respond through proper channels. You're welcome to wait for water before you ride back, Mr. Prescott, but I'd like you off my porch." She walked inside and found Harlan at the table and put the document in front of him and said, "He went around the fraud investigation. He's attacking the original title." Harlan read it. His face did not change, but his left hand, resting on the table, closed slowly into a fist. "Pecos Valley Properties," he said. "You know it." "Ooh. I know it's new. Incorporated in the last 2 weeks, I would guess." He looked up. A competing survey claim on original patent error is a civil matter entirely separate from the criminal fraud investigation. He's trying to move the fight to different ground where Briggs's authority doesn't reach, and where the affected family's testimonies are irrelevant. It comes down to a deed dispute in county court, which can take years and cost more than I have, she said. More than most people have. He was quiet for a moment, reading the document again. The 1871 survey it references that would be in the county deed records in Fort Stockton. We need to find the original survey and the original patent. He stood up. "Today." "I'll go," Jake said. He'd been in the doorway. "You and Margaret both," Harlan said. "I need the two of you to look at the original records together and identify anything that contradicts what this filing claims. I'll work the legal counter-argument from here." He looked at Margaret. "How fast can you ride to Fort Stockton?" 3 hours, she said. "Go." They rode hard, and they didn't talk much, which suited the situation, and also suited them. They had developed the kind of ease with each other that didn't require conversation to fill it, that could hold silence between them without weight. Margaret thought about Thomas, who had bought this land in 1874 from a man named Garrett, who had filed the original homestead patent in 1869. She had seen those papers once years ago, when Thomas had pulled them out to show her the boundaries. She remembered the specificity of the survey markers. Creek Bend rock formation, 3 connected post oaks that Thomas had joked were the 3 brothers of the property. She said this to Jake as they rode, going through it from memory, and he listened without interrupting. And by the time they were within a mile of Fort Stockton, she had talked herself into a clarity she hadn't had before. "The 3 post oaks are still there," she said. "On the northeast corner. I've ridden past them 100 times. "You know where they are precisely." "Precisely enough. If the original survey used them as a marker, and they're still there, that's physical evidence. That's not a paper dispute." Jake looked at her. "A land attorney would call that a natural monument marker. Courts give significant weight to surviving natural monuments in boundary disputes." He paused. Thomas knew what he was buying. Thomas was careful, she said, and the pride in her voice surprised her. He was careful about everything he signed. The county deed office was a 2-room building attached to the courthouse, and the man behind the records counter was elderly and meticulous in the way of people who have spent decades responsible for documents that outlast the people who create them. He found the 1869 patent and the 1874 transfer and the original survey notes in 40 minutes, which was itself a testament to his filing system, and he spread them on a wide table under a window and let Margaret and Jake look. The original survey was clear. The northeast corner marker was described in plain language: 3 post oak trees growing from a single root system situated 14 feet east of the creek bend, known locally as Garrett's Crossing. The boundary line ran from that point southwest by compass, bearing for 160 rods, to an iron stake thence. "Here," Jake set his finger on the page, "the competing claims survey. Look at the bearing from the creek bend. She looked at the document Prescott had delivered, which Harlan had sent with them. The competing survey described the same creek bend, but ran the boundary at a different compass, bearing 6 degrees further west, which over 160 rods would shift the boundary line significantly enough to put the main house and the well and the best grazing land outside the Sullivan claim. 6 degrees, she said. In 1871, 2 years after the original patent. Who surveyed it? Jake looked at the name on the competing survey document. Then he turned back to the 1869 original. Then he looked at Margaret with an expression she'd learned to read as controlled urgency. The 1871 survey was conducted by a man named R.L. Fowler. The 1869 original patent survey was also conducted by a man named R.L. Fowler. She stared at him. The same surveyor, she said. Filed 2 surveys of the same property 2 years apart with different boundary descriptions. And only the 1871 one, the one that shrinks your claim, appears in Pecos Valley Properties filing. He stood up. The 1871 survey was never recorded against the patent. It's in the county records, but it was never formally attached to the deed, which means someone went into those records recently, found an unattached survey that happened to contradict the patent, and built a claim around it. She looked at the county records clerk who was sitting at his counter with the careful non-attention of a man who is professionally uninvolved in other people's business. "Excuse me," she said. "This 1871 survey, R.L. Fowler, is there a notation of when this document was last accessed?" The clerk came over and looked at the folder. He turned to the access log on the back of the folder. County policy, he explained, all deed records required a sign-in, and ran his finger down the entries. "Last access before you two today was," he squinted, "11 days ago. Signed out to a Mr. P. Langford." "Do you know a P. Langford?" Jake said to Margaret. "No." She looked at the date. 11 days ago was 2 days before Briggs arrived. 2 days before Carver knew with certainty that the fraud investigation had enough to move forward. "He went looking for another weapon before Briggs even got here," she said. "He had this ready." Jake was already copying down the survey descriptions in a small notebook he carried. "Harlan needs the Fowler name and both survey dates. And the access log entry." He looked up. "Sir, is there any possibility we could obtain certified copies of both the 1869 and 1871 surveys?" The clerk looked at them both, then at the documents, then at the access log with the expression of a man who has spent 40 years in a deed office and knows when something is not right. "I can have those ready in an hour," he said. "Thank you," Margaret said. She sat down in the chair beside the table and let out a long, slow breath. Jake sat beside her, and for a moment they were just 2 people in a county deed office, with the afternoon light coming through the window, and the quiet scratching of the clerk's pen. And it was almost ordinary, and the ordinariness of it was something she could have cried for if she'd let herself. "He's not going to stop," she said quietly. "Even with Briggs, even with the fraud case, he's not going to stop." "No," Jake said. "Not until he has to." "When does he have to?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "When the cost of going forward is higher than the cost of stopping." He turned to look at her. "We're making it more expensive every day." She held his gaze. "Is it going to be enough?" He didn't give her false comfort. That was one of the things about him she'd come to rely on without meaning to. The straight answer, even when the straight answer was hard. "I don't know," he said. "But I know that right now today, we just found something that takes his best new weapon and turns it around. That's enough for today." She nodded. "That's enough for today," she said. They waited for the certified copies and rode back as the sun was lowering, and she felt the movement of the horse under her and the familiar smell of the dust and the dry grass and the particular quality of West Texas evening light, and she thought, "This is mine. This ground, this air, this particular light. I am not leaving it." Harlan took the survey documents and the Fowler name and worked through the night. By morning, he had it. R.L. Fowler had been a county surveyor in Crockett County from 1865 to 1878. In 1877, he had been quietly dismissed following a discrepancy in a survey he'd conducted for a water rights dispute, a discrepancy that had benefited the larger landowner in the case. The dismissal was recorded in county commissioner's minutes and had never been formally connected to any of his prior survey work, including the 1871 Sullivan Survey. Fowler had died in 1884. He was already known to produce surveys that served whoever was paying him, Harlan said, spreading his notes on the table. If we can show the court that the 1871 survey was conducted by a man with a documented history of producing compromised work, and that this survey was never formally recorded against the patent, never used in any subsequent transaction, never acknowledged by Thomas Sullivan or the original seller, then the competing claim has no legs. He paused. We also need to establish that the natural monument markers in the 1869 patent are still present and in the location described, the 3 post oaks. I can testify to that, Margaret said. I know exactly where they are. And I'd like a second witness, someone who's been on this property long enough to have independent knowledge of those markers. Pete, Margaret and Jake said simultaneously. Pete, when consulted, confirmed without hesitation that he'd been riding the northeast fence line for 11 years, and those 3 oaks were as fixed a landmark as anything in the county. He said this with the mild irritation of a man being asked to confirm something he considered self-evident. Pete, Harlan said, would you be willing to state that in court? Pete looked at him. Is this a serious question? It is. Then yes, Pete said, and went back to his coffee. The firefight, when it came, didn't come from Carver directly. It came on a Wednesday evening, late the purple edge of dark that particular West Texas hour, when you can still see shapes, but not faces. Jake was doing the perimeter check, and Margaret was in the barn, checking on a heifer that had been off her feed, and she heard the first shot from the east side of the property, with the specific clarity of a sound that your body understands before your mind catches up. She dropped flat against the hay without deciding to. Her hands were on the ground, breathing against the packed earth smell, and she was already thinking. Jake is on the east perimeter. The shot came from the east. Jake is. She was up and moving before she completed the thought. The second shot came from a different angle north of the first, and that told her something not 1 shooter but 2 placed to catch movement between the barn and the house. She went around the back of the barn instead, the long way keeping low and fast, and she heard Pete shouting from the house, and Harlan's voice sharp and commanding, and then Jake's voice from the east, still there alive, calling out, 2 shooters, east fence and north ridge. She got to the corner of the house and pressed against the wall. Pete was at the window with his rifle. Cody was behind him loading. Harlan was flat against the interior wall away from the windows, with the practical instinct of a man who understands his role in a gunfight is not to be in it. Jake's at the east fence, she said, coming through the back door low and fast. 2 shooters. He's pinned. Pete looked at her. Don't even think about... She took the second rifle from the rack beside the door. Margaret, cover the north ridge, she said. I'm going east. She went out the back before Pete could finish the argument, and she moved the way she'd moved on this property for 14 years, knowing every dip and rise, every place the ground fell away, every shadow that could be used. She wasn't reckless. She was fast and careful, and she knew this land better than anyone alive. She found Jake behind the water trough at the east fence, crouched low with a cut on his left arm that was bleeding steadily into his sleeve. He looked at her when she materialized out of the dark beside him with an expression that was simultaneously relieved and absolutely furious. I told you to stay. You didn't tell me anything you were getting shot at. She looked at his arm. How bad? Graze. It's fine. His jaw was tight. North shooter is on the ridge about 40 yards up. East shooter is at the fence line near the creek. They're waiting for someone to move into the open. Can you see them? East one moved twice. He's behind the big cottonwood at the creek bend. He paused. Margaret, these are not Carver's ranch hands. The way they set this up, the angles, the coverage, these are men who know what they're doing. She felt that land somewhere cold. Hired. Yes. From the house, Pete's rifle cracked once, and the north ridge went quiet in the way that meant either a hit or someone going to ground. One of the two. In the sudden relative silence, she heard movement at the east fence, the shooter shifting position, which meant he'd heard the shot from the house and was recalculating. "He's moving," she said. "I know. When he crosses the creek, he'll have to step into the open for about 3 seconds." She looked at Jake. He looked at her. She raised her rifle and waited. 3 seconds of open ground. The east shooter made his crossing, and Jake fired once, and the man went down hard into the shallow creek and didn't get back up. In the stillness that followed, Margaret became aware of her own heartbeat, fast and loud and completely steady, which surprised her until she realized it shouldn't. She'd been preparing for this without knowing it for weeks. Every morning she'd gotten up and done what needed doing, and this was what needed doing now, and her hands were not shaking. "Pete got the other one," Cody called from the house. "He's down. He's alive." Jake stood up slowly. He looked at his arm, then at Margaret, then at the east fence. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." She lowered the rifle. "You?" "Yes." He reached out and put his hand on the side of her face for one brief, fierce moment. Not romantic, not careful. Just the bare human acknowledgement that they were both still there, and then pulled it back. "Let's go see what Pete has." The North Ridge shooter was alive and unhappy about it. He was a lean man in his 40s with a hired gun quality about him. Nothing distinctive, nothing memorable. The face of a man who had worked to be forgettable. The federal marshal who arrived 2 hours later, Briggs had left one man stationed in Fort Stockton, with instructions to move if anything happened, confirmed within 20 minutes that the man had a warrant outstanding in 2 other counties under a different name. He didn't volunteer information. He sat against the barn wall with his hands bound and said nothing until the marshal made clear that the person he was protecting was already the subject of a federal fraud investigation, and therefore not in a position to protect him. Back at which point the man looked at the ground for a long moment and said one word, "Carver." That was all they needed. Jake's arm needed stitching. He argued about this with the same level of success that most people had arguing with Margaret Sullivan about anything that involved the care of people she'd decided were her responsibility. She sat him down at the kitchen table that had held everything, and she cleaned the wound with the matter-of-fact competence of a woman who had been patching up ranch hands and livestock for 14 years, and he sat still and let her. "This is going to scar," she said. "I have others." "I know." She tied off the last stitch. Her hands were still steady. She hadn't realized until she put the needle down that she'd been afraid not in the field, not when it mattered, but now here in the kitchen light, looking at the evidence of how close it had been. The cut was 4 inches long, and an inch to the right of where it was something different entirely. She left her hands on his arm for a moment after she finished. Just for a moment. "Margaret," he said quietly. She looked up. "I'm all right," he said, like he knew what she was calculating. "We're all right." She nodded. She took her hands back. She stood up and put the medical supplies away and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him and sat down across the table and said, "He used hired guns. He fired on a federal investigation. That's not a man who is managing a legal strategy anymore. That's a man who's panicking." "Yes," Harlan said from the doorway. He came in and sat down heavily, looking his age in a way he usually didn't. "And a panicking man with Carver's resources is still dangerous. But," he paused, "tonight changes the criminal exposure considerably. Conspiracy to commit assault on witnesses in a federal investigation. Attempted murder. That's not land fraud anymore. That's a different category of crime with different consequences." "Will Briggs move faster now?" Jake asked. "Briggs will be here himself by the end of the week," Harlan said. "I'd stake my license on it." Margaret drank her coffee. She looked at the table. Thomas's table. The table she'd spread documents on and eaten breakfast on and pressed her hands against in the dark when the fear got too large to carry. She looked at Harlan and Jake and thought about Pete asleep in the bunkhouse. Already Pete, who had been here for 11 years and was still here, and Cody, who was 19 and had stayed, and her gray mare in the near pasture, and the 3 post oak trees on the northeast corner that had been exactly where they were supposed to be for as long as anyone could remember. "We hold," she said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a speech. It was just a statement of fact, the same way Thomas used to state things plainly, without decoration, because plain, true things didn't need decoration. Jake looked at her across the table. "We hold," he said. Outside, the West Texas night pressed in around the house, vast and dark and older than any of the things that were happening in it. And inside the kitchen, the lamp burned steady, and the coffee was hot, and Margaret Sullivan sat at her table and did not go anywhere. Briggs arrived on Friday, not at the end of the week, as Harlan had predicted, but 2 days earlier, and he didn't come quietly. He came with 6 federal marshals, a state attorney from Austin named Clara Voss, who was sharp-eyed and moved like someone who had been waiting for this particular case for a long time, and a written federal warrant for the arrest of William Carver on charges that now included conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. The hired shooters having confirmed separately, and with the enthusiasm of men negotiating their own futures, that Carver had personally authorized the Wednesday night attack. Margaret stood on her porch and watched them ride in, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long, she almost didn't recognize it. Not relief exactly, not victory. Something quieter than both the particular settling of a thing that has been held in tension for too long, finally allowed to find its natural resting place. Jake stood beside her. Pete and Cody came out of the barn. Harlan appeared at the door behind her. Briggs dismounted and looked at Margaret's arm. She'd taken a splinter of fence post to the forearm in the firefight minor, she'd bandaged it herself and not mentioned it, and said without preamble, "How are you?" "Standing," she said. "Good." He turned to his team with the efficient manner of a man who had planned this conversation in advance, and was moving through it precisely. "Clara, you have the warrants. Davis Henderson, I want 2 men on the Carver property by noon. He doesn't know we're here yet, and I'd like to keep it that way for as long as possible." He turned back to Margaret. "We're going to need you in Fort Stockton by Monday. Full testimony, formal deposition. Everything you've told me informally on the record signed." "Monday," she said. "Yes." "And Jake?" Briggs looked at him. "The El Paso report, the title company investigation. Your identification of the Fowler survey discrepancy. All of it needs to be formally submitted as evidentiary record. Clara will walk you through the process." "I know the process," Jake said. "I know you do." Briggs almost smiled. "That's why I'm not worried about it." Clara Voss came up to the porch and introduced herself to Margaret with a direct handshake and the manner of a woman who had learned early that being underestimated was either an insult to be corrected or a tool to be used, and had chosen tool. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've read everything Briggs sent me. I want you to know what you did here, what you built from your kitchen table against people who had every structural advantage. It's the reason this case has teeth. I don't say that lightly." Margaret looked at her. "Will it hold in court?" "It will hold," Clara said, and she said it the way she probably said everything, like a fact, not a hope. "Height's testimony alone is damning. Morse's testimony on top of it is redundant in the best possible way. The Fowler survey fraud gives us the property title angle. And the hired shooters—" She paused. "Carver authorized an attack on federal investigation witnesses. There is no version of this where that doesn't define the outcome." Margaret breathed in, breathed out. "And the other families. Dale Patterson, the Reyes family, Tolliver. Patterson's property restoration is already in motion. I filed the paperwork before I left Austin. The Reyes case is more complex because the sale has been completed and the subsequent owner is a third party not involved in the fraud, but we have remedies available." Clara looked at her steadily. "I won't promise you that everyone gets everything back. The law is slower than the harm. But I will tell you that every family that lost something to this scheme will be heard in court with their name on the record against his." That was enough. It wasn't everything. It was enough. Carver was arrested at his property at 11:45 that morning. Margaret didn't see it happen. She heard about it from the marshal named Davis, who came back to the Sullivan Ranch at midday to report procedurally, factually, the way federal men reported things. Carver had been in his study when they arrived. He had not resisted. He had said nothing except to ask for his attorney, which was his right, and his attorney had been sent for, and he was now in custody in Fort Stockton, awaiting formal arraignment. No speech, no dramatic last stand. Just a man in a study being handed a warrant and the long, quiet implosion of something that had believed itself untouchable. Margaret was at the kitchen table when Davis told her this. She nodded. She thanked him. After he left, she sat alone for a moment in the kitchen. Everyone else was outside. Pete talking to the marshals, Harlan going over documents with Clara, Jake somewhere with Cody working on the preliminary assessment for the barn rebuild, and she put both hands flat on Thomas's table, and she said quietly to no one, and to him, "I held it. Thomas, I held it." The table was solid under her hands. The kitchen was warm. Outside she could hear Pete's voice, and further off, Jake's a question, and then Cody's answer, and then Jake's short, honest laugh, that she had come to love the way you love the most reliable things. She sat there for 30 seconds, maybe 40, in the only private moment she would have all day. Then she stood up, pushed the chair back, and went outside to see what needed doing next. Elijah Morse was formally charged 2 days later, and the charges against him were the moment that clarified for the county, for everyone who had watched and whispered and waited to see which way this fell, that the ground had shifted permanently. Morse had been the bank's face in this county for 11 years. People had signed papers across from him. They had believed him when he said things were standard routine the way things were done. The charges against him: conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of financial records, breach of fiduciary duty across 14 documented cases, named the thing that everyone had sensed and not been able to prove. The bank itself came under federal conservatorship within the week. Its doors stayed open because the town needed a bank, but its management was removed pending full audit, and every loan under active collection in the county was frozen, while investigators went through the records page by page. Dorothy Sims came to see Margaret on a Thursday morning. She came without a pie dish or a pretext which was already different. She sat at the kitchen table and she said, "I owe you an apology." Margaret poured coffee and set a cup in front of her. "For what?" "For what I said. About the man. About how it looked." Dorothy wrapped her hands around the cup. "I was repeating what people said because I thought it was helpful. It wasn't helpful. I was frightened, I think, of what you were doing, of the fact that you weren't doing what everyone expected." She looked up. "I'm sorry, Margaret." Margaret sat down across from her. She looked at Dorothy, who was her neighbor, who had brought food after Thomas's funeral, who had said a thoughtless thing from a frightened place, and had now come in person without any cover story to say so. "It's all right," she said. "You weren't the only one who thought it. But I was one of them." Dorothy paused. "What you and that man and Harlan Webb did, Dale Patterson has his land back. Did you know? He got the letter yesterday. He called it from the telegraph office, and the operator told half the town." She smiled, and there was something wet in her eyes that she was managing with the discipline of a woman who had not planned to cry this morning. "He's coming back. Dale's coming back." Margaret felt it hit her, somewhere low and solid, the image of Dale on that barrel, the cold coffee, the look on his face. "Coming back." "That's good news," she said. Her voice was steady. "That's the best news." The formal deposition in Fort Stockton took 3 days and was the most exhausting thing Margaret had ever done that didn't involve physical labor. Clara Voss walked her through it with meticulous patience, every document, every date, every conversation she could recall, every decision she had made, and why. Margaret answered everything directly and completely, and without embellishment, because she had learned a long time ago that the truth told plainly was more powerful than the truth dressed up, and also because she was too tired to dress anything up. Jake testified separately. She didn't hear his testimony, and he didn't hear hers, which was deliberate. Clara wanted no possibility of their accounts influencing each other. wanted the clean parallel lines of two independent witnesses saying the same things from their own perspective. They crossed paths in the hallway between sessions on the second day, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and he said, "How are you holding up?" And she said, "I'm fine, how are you?" And he said, "Fine." And they both knew they were both lying, and it didn't matter, because they were almost through it. On the third day, Clara called them both into the room together for a final session, going over the timeline of events from Jake's arrival on the property through the Wednesday night attack, establishing the full sequence for the record. She asked her questions crisply, and they answered, and the court reporter typed, and the afternoon light moved slowly across the floor. At one point, Clara asked, "Mr. Ryland, at what point did you become aware that the Sullivan property was specifically targeted by Carver's scheme, rather than simply being one of many potential acquisitions?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "When Carver came to the property himself," he said, "men like that don't make personal appearances unless the situation is personal. He'd been using Morse as the instrument for everything else. Coming himself meant Margaret Mrs. Sullivan had become a specific problem to him rather than a general opportunity. And why did she become a specific problem? Because she pushed back on the interest rate," Jake said. "Because she noticed the discrepancy and said so directly. Most people in her situation would have not believed it, but accepted it. Taken it as the reality because the bank said so, and what do you do against a bank?" He paused. "She didn't accept it. She named it out loud and she kept her original documentation and she started asking questions. That's what made her dangerous to him." Clara made a note. "Mrs. Sullivan, is that an accurate characterization of your actions?" Margaret looked at the table for a moment, and then she looked up. "I noticed it, and I wasn't willing to pretend I hadn't," she said. "Thomas signed for 6%. The paper said 8. I know the difference between 6 and 8. I didn't see why I should act like I didn't." The court reporter typed. Clara nodded. "That will be all for today." They rode back to the ranch in the early evening, the two of them, and for a long time neither spoke. The case was built. The testimony was given. The machinery that Harlan and Clara and Briggs had assembled was now moving forward under its own momentum, and Margaret was no longer the driving force of it. She had handed it off formally and completely, and what happened next in courtrooms and federal offices was going to happen without her being in the room. She found that she didn't know what to do with that. For so long, the case had been the shape of every day the organizing principle around which everything else arranged itself. Now it was done, or done enough, and what was left was the land and the cattle and the burned foundation of the barn and the regular work of a ranch in August with everything that needed doing before fall. And Jake. She'd been not thinking about Jake with considerable discipline for weeks, keeping it in the category of things that would wait until there was time for them. There was time now. She could feel it, the particular spaciousness of a life that had been operating in emergency finally allowed to breathe. She said when they were a mile from the property, "You have a name in Amarillo." He didn't answer right away. "I do." "Is it still waiting?" "Probably not," he said. "It's been 2 months. They would have found someone else." She looked at the road ahead. "And the title company work. There's always more of that somewhere." He was quiet. "Margaret, I'm asking because I need to know," she said. "I'm not asking to hold you here. I want you to understand that. If you need to go, you go. What you've done here is more than I can—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not asking because I'm afraid to be alone. I've been alone. I know how to do it." "I know you do," he said. "I'm asking because—" She stopped again, and this time the stop was longer because she was trying to find the honest shape of a thing that she'd been keeping carefully shapeless for a long time. "Because I would like you to stay. Not because I need you to. Because I want you to. And I've been confusing those two things deliberately for weeks because wanting something felt dangerous and needing it felt more justifiable, and I'm—" She almost laughed. "I'm tired of justifying things." He pulled his horse to a stop. She pulled hers to a stop beside him. They were a mile from the property in the open land, with the evening spreading in every direction and nobody else anywhere near them. I'm not going to Amarillo, he said. She looked at him. I haven't been planning to go to Amarillo since about the third week I was here, he said. I was waiting to see if you wanted me to stay. I wasn't going to push it. You had enough being pushed. I thought if you wanted me gone, you'd say so. I'm not good at saying things like that, she said. I know. The corner of his mouth moved. You're better at doing them. You did just about everything except say it. She held his gaze in the evening light, and she thought about that night in the kitchen. His hands flat on the table, not reaching just present, and her hand crossing the space between them. She thought about the storm and his grip on her arm, and the word, "I've got you," said like a fact. She thought about sitting beside her at the table, instead of across from it, the small geography of choosing closeness without requiring permission. Stay, she said, plainly, without decoration. The way she'd learned was more powerful than anything dressed up. He held her eyes for a long moment. Yes, he said. Just that. Just yes. They rode the last mile home in the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. The arraignment was in September, and Margaret was there, and the courtroom in Fort Stockton was full in a way that courtrooms rarely were. Ranchers and their wives who had been watching neighbors who had held back and now felt the permission to be present. Dale Patterson 3 rows back, with the look of a man who had been given something he'd stopped expecting. Margaret sat in the front row beside Harlan with Clara Voss at the prosecution table and Jake directly behind her. Carver came in with 2 attorneys and the careful composure of a man who had decided that composure was his last remaining asset. He didn't look at Margaret. She looked at him directly and without hostility, with the flat attention of a woman who was cataloging something she wanted to remember accurately. He looked smaller than he had in her yard. That was the thing about power built on other people's vulnerability. Once the vulnerability was gone, the power had nothing to stand on. The charges were read. The pleas entered. The schedule for trial set. It was procedural and measured and entirely undramatic in its form, which was somehow more satisfying than anything dramatic would have been. The grinding, serious machinery of accountability doing what it was supposed to do. When it was over and the courtroom was emptying, Dale Patterson came up beside her and put his hand briefly on her arm and said, "Thank you, Margaret." 2 words. She nodded. That was enough. Asipo. The Reyes family came to the ranch in October. Elena and Marco Reyes, she was 40, he was 45, and they had a 14-year-old daughter named Rosa, who stayed close to her mother's side with the watchful eyes of a child who had seen her parents go through something large. They had driven 2 hours to come, which told Margaret something about what they needed from the visit before a word was said. Elena sat at Margaret's kitchen table and told her what had happened to their property. Not the legal version, not the case file version, but the human version. The morning the bankmen came, the drive away. The 8 months in her brother's house in San Marcos. Marco working day labor because that was what was available. Rosa changing schools twice. She told it plainly and without excessive emotion, the way people told things that were still too close to perform. Margaret listened the way she liked to be listened to, completely without interruption, without the particular sympathy that felt more like pity than understanding. When Elena finished, she said, "The property transfer is being reviewed. Clara Voss told me your case is one of the strongest." "But the man who bought it," Elena said. "He's not part of the fraud. He bought it in good faith." "Yes," Margaret said. "That makes it more complicated. But there are remedies compensation from the bank's assets which are currently under federal conservatorship. It won't be exactly what you had, but it won't be nothing." Elena was quiet for the moment. "I told Marco we should come here because I needed to see the person who started this, who kept fighting when we had already given up." She looked at Margaret with dark eyes that had a directness in them Margaret recognized and respected. "How did you not give up?" Margaret thought about this honestly. "I was angry more than I was scared," she said. "When I'm angry, I can't seem to stop moving. Scared makes you freeze. Angry makes you go." She paused. "And I had people around me who stayed." She felt Jake behind her in the doorway, not entering, giving the conversation its privacy. She didn't turn around, but she knew he was there, had learned to know it the way you learn the feel of solid ground. Rosa, the 14-year-old, had been looking at everything in the kitchen with the careful attention of young people who are trying to understand adult things by collecting evidence. She looked at Margaret and said, "Were you ever really scared?" Everyone at the table looked at her. Elena started to redirect, and Margaret raised one hand slightly. "Yes," she said to Rosa directly. "Every day. But being scared doesn't mean you stop. It just means you're paying attention." Rosa absorbed this. "My dad said you fought them with paper," she said. "He said you beat guns with paper." Margaret smiled genuinely, the kind that came from somewhere real. "Paper and good people," she said. "And stubbornness. A lot of stubbornness." The trial date was set for the following spring, and the months between were the first months in over 2 years that Margaret moved through without the constant pressure of a deadline aimed at her like a weapon. She noticed the difference in her body before she noticed it anywhere else. She slept through the night, woke before dawn by choice, rather than by dread, ate full meals that she actually tasted. The barn went up in November, a proper rebuild. Pete and Cody and Jake working it alongside 2 neighboring ranchers who showed up one morning without being asked and stayed for a week, which was the West Texas way of saying what words apparently couldn't. Dale Patterson came one Saturday with his truck and 4 posts he'd cut himself and worked from sunup to dark without stopping. He and Pete didn't talk much, but they worked in the easy rhythm of 2 men who understood each other completely. Margaret watched this from a distance that first day, and felt something happen in her chest that she had no name for. Not happiness exactly, more like the recognition of something she'd forgotten was possible. That people showed up. That neighbors were real. That the land was worth fighting for, not just because it was hers, but because it was part of something, a web of people and work and interdependence that Carver and his scheme had tried to sever and had not. Jake worked beside Pete and Dale and said little and did a great deal, which was his nature. On the second evening of the rebuild, Margaret brought food out for everyone, and the 5 of them sat on the unfinished barn foundation in the early dark and ate, and nobody said anything about the case or the trial or anything that had happened, and the conversation was about cattle prices and the coming winter and whether the creek would hold water through December. And it was ordinary in the most extraordinary way she could imagine. The twist that no one had seen coming arrived in December in a letter from Clara Voss. Vernon Aldridge, the deputy land commissioner, who had resigned in September and had been quietly cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for reduced exposure, had provided as part of that cooperation documentation that went considerably higher than anyone had expected. Not one state official, but 3. A sitting state senator, whose name Margaret recognized from election placards. A railroad company executive, whose involvement in the right-of-way scheme had been masked through 3 layers of holding companies. And most significantly, the original architect of the entire scheme, who was not Carver at all, Carver. It turned out, was the instrument. The man who had approached him 5 years ago with the framework, the railroad route, the land acquisition strategy, the bank arrangement, was a man named Hargrove, a land speculator based in Houston who had run similar operations in 2 other states before moving to Texas, who had never appeared in any county record, who had kept himself entirely invisible behind Carver and Aldridge and Morse and Haight and all the other people willing to be visible in exchange for their cut. Harlan read the letter twice. He set it on the table. He looked at Margaret and Jake and Cody, who happened to be in the kitchen when it arrived. He said, "This is no longer a West Texas land fraud case." "What is it?" Cody said. "It's a federal case that will take years and reach people in Houston and Austin and possibly beyond, and it will be the most significant land fraud prosecution in Texas history." He looked at Margaret. "Your kitchen table is where it started." She looked at the table. Thomas's table. The one she'd pressed her hands against in the dark so many times to keep herself steady. The one that had held every document, every argument, Every late-night cup of coffee that had kept her moving when moving felt impossible. "My kitchen table," she said quietly, "is where Thomas and I ate breakfast for 17 years. She looked up. The rest of it started because someone thought a widow wouldn't notice what they'd done to her husband's signature. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Pete from the doorway said, "Is there coffee?" Because Pete was Pete, and some things were more important than being profound about them. The trial, when it came in April, was not the dramatic courtroom confrontation that Margaret had spent months half expecting and half dreading. It was methodical and grinding, and lasted 11 days. And the most dramatic moment was probably when Gerald Height took the stand and laid out in precise detail the specific alterations he had made to the bank's records and on whose instruction his voice steady and his face the face of a man paying a debt he had owed for 3 years. Carver's attorneys were skilled and relentless, and it didn't matter. The documentation was overwhelming. Height's testimony was corroborated at every point by the physical records. Morse's testimony, given with the deflated cooperativeness of a man who had stopped pretending, filled the gaps. Jake's account of the El Paso connection, delivered with the calm precision of a man used to presenting evidence, established the pattern across state lines. And Margaret's testimony, 3 hours on the stand, every question answered directly, every document identified and explained in the plain language of a woman who had lived through the thing she was describing, was, Clara told her afterward, the thing the jury had believed most completely. She was on the stand when Carver's lead attorney asked her, "Mrs. Sullivan, isn't it true that you allowed a man whose background and intentions you did not fully know to live on your property and become involved in your personal and legal affairs?" She looked at the attorney. Then she looked at Jake in the gallery, who met her eyes steadily. Then she looked back at the attorney and said, "I made a decision about who to trust based on what I observed. He worked hard, he told me the truth, and he stayed when things got difficult. That's not an unknown quantity. That's a known one." The attorney had no useful follow-up to that. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. Guilty on all primary counts. Sentencing to be determined, but Clara had already told her privately the range they were seeking, and it was not small. Margaret heard the verdict and sat very still for a moment in the gallery. She didn't celebrate. She didn't cry. She sat with the fact of it, the solid, complete, irreversible fact, and she let it be real. Harlan put his hand on her arm briefly. Clara turned from the prosecution table and caught her eye and nodded once. Dale Patterson, 2 rows back, exhaled so loudly that the woman beside him looked over. Jake was beside her when she stood up. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. They walked out of the courtroom together into the April afternoon, into the particular quality of Texas spring light that was warm and honest and very clear, and she stood on the courthouse steps and looked out at Fort Stockton and thought, "It's done. Not everything." The Hargrove federal case was still years away. The Reyes family was still in negotiation. The other cases were still being worked through. There was still so much that the machinery of justice had to grind through before it was finished. But this part, the part that had started with Thomas's ledger and a discrepancy between 6 and 8, the part that had nearly cost her the land and the cattle and the barn, and twice nearly cost her life itself, this part was done. She had held. Keg. Summer came back to the Sullivan Ranch the way Summer always did in West Texas, without apology and without restraint. The new barn stood solid, the wood still fresh-smelling, the roof tight. The cattle were back to 61 head, better than she'd had since before Thomas got sick. The well ran clear. The 3 post oak trees on the northeast corner stood exactly where they'd always stood, roots deep and permanent, indifferent to everything that had tried to happen around them. Pete stayed. Cody stayed. He'd told Margaret in March that he was staying and delivered this information with the matter-of-fact finality of someone who had decided a thing and didn't require discussion. Harlan came back twice, once on case business and once just to visit, and sat on the porch with Pete and talked about things that had nothing to do with fraud or courts or documents, and Margaret listened from inside and found she liked the sound of it. Jake stayed. He had said yes in October on the road home, and he had meant it. And he went on meaning it every day after that, in the straightforward way of a man who made decisions cleanly and stood by them. He ran the cattle work alongside Pete, with the ease of someone who'd been doing it his whole life, and maybe always been meant to do it here specifically. He fixed things before they needed fixing, which had been Thomas's habit too, and Margaret had noticed this overlap without comment, had let it be what it was, rather than what it was like. They were not in a hurry. That was the other thing, neither of them rushed toward anything, and it was deliberate. A mutual understanding that they were building something that deserved to be built right, rather than fast. They shared the evening hours and the morning coffee and the kitchen table and the particular ease of two people who had been through something hard together and come out on the same side of it. One evening in July, after supper, Jake and Margaret sat on the porch in the long, warm dark the way they'd been doing for months. The way she expected they'd be doing for a long time. And she was thinking about nothing in particular, just the night and the sound of the cattle settling, and the way the stars were coming out one at a time. The way they always did, when Jake said quietly, "I'd trade 10 herds for one night with you." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the stars, a slight smile at the corner of his mouth unhurried. He'd said it the same way he said everything plain honest, not asking permission. She thought about the first time he'd said it that stormy kitchen night, his hands flat on the table, confessing something he'd been carrying long enough that it needed to be put down. She thought about what she had felt, then terrified and certain in equal measure, which she'd learned was what truth felt like when it finally came close enough to touch. She looked at this man beside her on Thomas's porch, on her porch, on their porch. She looked at his profile against the summer dark, and she thought about everything that had been required to arrive at this exact moment. The ledger and the lawyer and the long nights and the barn burning and the shots in the dark and the courtroom and the verdict and all of it. Every hard thing, every day she'd gotten up when getting up was the hardest possible thing to do. She had held the land. She had held herself. She had held her word to Thomas and her word to herself, and in the end, she had chosen not been saved, not been rescued, not been given anything she hadn't earned. She had chosen her land, her life. And this man who had ridden in on a lame horse and stayed for every reason that mattered. She reached over and took his hand. "I know," she said, and smiled, not the careful, managed smile of a woman holding herself together, not the polite smile of someone surviving, but the real one, the one that came from somewhere she'd kept protected for a very long time and could now afford to let out. So would I. The Texas night held them both warm and vast and full of stars, and Margaret Sullivan, who was nobody's widow, nobody's victim, nobody's cautionary tale, sat on her own land with the man she had chosen, and felt for the first time in longer than she could name completely and entirely at home. She had never surrendered. She had never run. She had stood in the dust of her own life and fought for it with every document and every sleepless night and every plain true word she had, and she had won it back. Not from Carver, not from the bank, not from any of the forces that had tried to take it. She had won it back from the grief that had nearly convinced her that holding on was the same thing as living. It was not the same thing. She knew that now. This right here, this porch, this hand in hers, this particular July night with everything still ahead of it. This was living, and Margaret Sullivan had chosen it with her whole heart on her own terms, and she was never going to stop.